We stand at the edge of history, looking back at a ghost. The first cities, the first written words, the first laws, all rise from the silt of Mesopotamia, bearing the name of Sumer. Yet after millennia of vibrant life, the Sumerian language dies on the tongues of its people, their temples crumble, and their civilization dissolves into the dust of southern Iraq, becoming a mystery that archaeology, even today, is still piecing together, wondering how a people who invented so much of our world could so completely disappear. What truly silenced the scribes of Ur and Uruk remains a question whispered between the reeds of the Euphrates, a puzzle of climate, conquest, and time. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where and when you're listening from tonight. The story of the Sumerians, however unsettling, is the story of a civilization we found. Their history is written on clay tablets, emerging from the patient work of archaeologists who brushed away the sand to reveal the foundations of a very real, tangible world. We know their gods, we can read their lamentations, and we can trace the boundaries of their empires. But our journey tonight is not into a mystery that was solved, but into a mystery that was invented. We are searching for a world far older, far vaster, and infinitely more elusive than Sumer, a continent that vanished not into the sand, but into the sea, leaving behind only the most tantalizing and speculative of clues. This is the story of a lost paradise, a scientific hypothesis that became a powerful modern myth, a place known as Lemuria. Our narrative begins not in the ancient world, but in the smoky, gaslit parlors and laboratories of the 19th century, an age of profound discovery and equally profound confusion. This was a time when the maps of the world were finally being filled in, yet the depths of the oceans remained as mysterious as the surface of the moon. Charles Darwin's new theory of evolution by natural selection had shaken the very foundations of human origin, proposing that all life was connected through an immense, branching tree of ancestry that stretched back into an abyss of deep time. This new understanding created pressing, difficult questions. If species evolved in one place, how did they or their close relatives appear on opposite sides of the planet, separated by thousands of miles of impassable ocean? This was an era before the concept of continental drift, before the revelation of plate tectonics. The continents, in the 19th century mind, were fixed, permanent features of the globe, locked in place since the beginning of time. To solve the puzzle of these strange biological distributions, scientists proposed a beautifully simple, elegant, and ultimately incorrect idea: lost land bridges. They imagined great causeways of earth, now sunken, that had once connected the continents, allowing animals and plants to migrate freely across the seas. The Atlantic was thought to have been spanned by a bridge here, the Pacific by another there. The maps of this speculative age were crisscrossed with phantom highways, invisible architectures of biogeography. These were not considered fantasies, but necessary deductions, the most logical explanation for the patterns of life that scientists were observing in places like South America, Africa, and distant Australia. They were seeking a mechanism for evolution, a way to connect the scattered dots of life on Earth. This intellectual environment, This fertile ground of scientific imagination was precisely where the seed of our story would be planted. The search was on for a mechanism, a missing piece of the puzzle that would explain how life, and perhaps even humanity itself, had spread across the globe. The mystery did not lie in cuneiform tablets or shattered pottery, but in the quiet, unassuming existence of a small, nocturnal primate. The clue was not a golden mask or a king's tomb, but the soft fur and wide, staring eyes of an animal that seemed to exist in two places at once, a biological ghost haunting lands separated by the vast blue expanse of the Indian Ocean. The stage was set for a simple observation by a biologist to ignite one of the most enduring myths of a lost world, a single hypothesis that would soon spiral out of the dry pages of scientific journals and into the realms of occult mysticism, spiritual prophecy, and the deepest human longing for a forgotten beginning. The search for Lemuria was, at its heart, a search for a home we never knew we had. The world of 19th century science was one of meticulous categorization, a grand project of ordering all living things into a coherent, understandable system. It was a time of collectors, of cabinets filled with exotic birds, pressed flowers, and strange bones sent back from the far corners of an expanding empire. In this world of careful labels and precise taxonomies worked a respected British zoologist and ornithologist named Philip Lutley Sclater. He was a man of science, a secretary of the Zoological Society of London, whose days were spent not in mystical reverie, but in the painstaking study of animal distribution, a field we now call biogeography. He was, in essence, a mapmaker of life, attempting to chart the unseen boundaries and kingdoms of the animal world, seeking the logic behind why certain creatures lived where they did and nowhere else. His focus was not on lost civilizations, but on finches, mammals, and reptiles, and in 1864, his attention was captured by a particularly peculiar group of small nocturnal primates, the lemurs. These creatures, with their soft fur, grasping hands, and luminous, haunting eyes, were themselves a biological puzzle. Sclater observed, as did others, that the vast majority of the lemur family, a diverse group of dozens of species, was found in one place and one place only: the immense island of Madagascar, floating in the Indian Ocean off the coast of Africa. This island was their stronghold, their evolutionary cradle. Yet the puzzle deepened when Sclater and his contemporaries looked at the fossils. They found ancient, extinct relatives of lemurs not just in Madagascar, but also, bafflingly, in the distant lands of India and Southeast Asia. Furthermore, living relatives, such as lorises and galagos, which belonged to the same primate suborder, were spread across both Africa and Asia. The map of their existence made no logical sense. Here was the conundrum that faced Sclater, a problem that struck at the heart of the new evolutionary theory. If these small primates had evolved in a single location, as Darwin's ideas suggested, how had they traversed the more than 2,000 miles of open, hostile salt water that separated Madagascar from the coast of India? The lemurs were not strong swimmers. They were small mammals adapted for life in trees. They could not have island hopped, as there were no islands to hop to. They could not have floated on debris, as the currents and the sheer distance made this explanation statistically impossible for an entire population. And in the 19th century worldview, the continents themselves had never moved. Africa had always been where Africa was, and India had always been where India was. Sclater, staring at this impossible distribution, reached for the most rational tool available to him, the hypothesis of a lost land bridge. It was the only explanation that fit the facts as he understood them. He postulated that in a remote geological past, a great landmass must have existed in the Indian Ocean. It was not an idea born of fantasy, but of logical necessity, a bridge of the mind built to solve a biological paradox. This was the required corridor, the ancient highway that had allowed the ancestors of the lemurs and countless other species of plants and animals to migrate freely between these now distant lands. He envisioned a long-gone territory, perhaps a triangular continent or a series of massive islands that directly connected Madagascar, the southern tip of India, and the Malay archipelago. This, he reasoned, would perfectly explain the strange similarities in the flora and fauna of these regions. It would explain the lemurs in Madagascar and their fossilized cousins in India. Once this land bridge had served its evolutionary purpose, allowing life to spread, it must have, through some unknown and slow geological process, subsided beneath the waves, leaving only the clues of its existence in the creatures that remained, marooned on the surviving mountain peaks we now call islands and subcontinents. Sclater was not an occultist. He was a scientist, applying the principle of Occam's razor, finding the simplest solution to a vexing problem. This intellectual creation, this phantom land, was a piece of rigorous scientific speculation, a hypothesis awaiting geological confirmation that in the 19th century seemed perfectly plausible. He had drawn the boundaries of a lost world based on the silent testimony of a small, wide-eyed primate. All that remained was to give this hypothetical, sunken kingdom a name. Philip Sclater, having constructed this necessary bridge in his mind, now required a name for it, a formal designation that could be printed in the sober, black and white pages of a scientific journal. He was not a poet, inclined to draw upon ancient myth or legend. He was a taxonomist, a man who believed in order, and the most logical name was one derived directly from the very creature that had posed the riddle. The existence of this land bridge was inferred from the strange distribution of the lemurs, and so, with the simple, direct logic of a 19th century scientist, Sclater christened his hypothetical sunken landmass Lemuria. The name was a piece of academic shorthand, a label for a proposed solution born of ink and paper and scholarly debate. It was a name that carried the echo of the wide-eyed creatures of Madagascar, a testament to the biological mystery that had birthed it. In 1864, the name Lemuria made its first official appearance in the world, not in a mystical tract or a novel of adventure, but in a respectable article in the Quarterly Journal of Science. The paper itself, titled The Mammals of Madagascar, was a work of careful zoological observation, and in it, Sclater formally proposed his hypothesis. He wrote of this great, submerged continent that he believed had once stretched across the Indian Ocean, a territory that had been the original homeland of the lemur family. In his view, this land had fractured and sunk, leaving Madagascar as its last great bastion, a sort of evolutionary museum preserving the creatures that had once roamed a far wider world. This, he argued, was the only way to explain the very curious fact that lemur-like animals were found in India and the Malay archipelago, yet were conspicuously absent from the nearby African continent. The proposal was not met with ridicule. On the contrary, it was embraced by many of Sclater's most respected contemporaries as a brilliant and necessary deduction. It solved not only the lemur problem, but many other biogeographical puzzles that had plagued naturalists. Scientists studying snails, botanists charting the spread of plant families, and herpetologists tracking reptiles all saw in Lemuria a powerful explanatory tool. It was a hypothesis that tidied up the messy, scattered data of life, fitting it neatly into the 19th century model of a world with fixed continents. It became, for a time, a settled piece of the scientific consensus, a feature of the deep past that was as accepted as the existence of the ice ages. Maps of the ancient world, drawn by other naturalists, began to appear with the continent of Lemuria sketched in, its great triangular shape filling the vast blue void of the Indian Ocean. It is important to rest here for a moment, in this purely scientific context, and understand what Lemuria was and what it was not. In Sclater's formulation, it was an animal kingdom, not a human one. It was a biological corridor, a vast forested landmass, but it was not populated by ancient sages, advanced civilizations, or lost temples. Its purpose was to explain the migration of primates and plants, not the origin of humanity or the source of forgotten wisdom. It was a mundane, if massive, piece of geology, or rather paleogeography. It was no more magical than the other, similar land bridges that were being proposed all over the globe, such as Arch Hellenis in the Atlantic, or the various bridges connecting Asia and North America. It was a tool for thinking, a hypothesis that, like a scaffold, was built to solve a problem and was expected to be discarded once a better explanation arrived. But a name, once released into the world, does not remain the sole property of its creator. The word Lemuria held a certain resonance, a whisper of something lost and ancient. It was a beautiful, melancholic-sounding name, far more evocative than a dry, technical designation. It conjured images of a forgotten time, a land of strange creatures now sleeping beneath the waves. This seed, planted in the dry, academic soil of zoology, had an imaginative power that Sclater himself likely never intended. It was a name waiting for a grander story, a vessel ready to be filled with new, more profound, and far more human mysteries. The quiet zoologist had provided the name and the location, but the next chapter of our story would be written by a far more ambitious thinker, a German biologist who would see in this sunken land bridge not just a pathway for lemurs, but the very cradle of mankind. The idea was about to migrate from the realm of zoology to the far more explosive realm of human anthropology. The name Lemuria, once coined, began its inevitable migration across the disciplines of 19th century thought, and its next host was a figure far more flamboyant and influential than the reserved Philip Sclater. This was Ernst Haeckel, a brilliant, controversial, and immensely popular German biologist, naturalist, and artist. Haeckel was one of Charles Darwin's most zealous champions on the continent, a man who saw in evolution not just a biological mechanism, but a grand, unifying philosophy of all life, a new worldview that could replace the old dogmas of religion. He was a scientist with the soul of an evangelist, and his wildly popular books, illustrated with his own stunning, intricate drawings of microscopic life, brought the epic story of evolution to the masses. But Haeckel was obsessed with one particular, glaring gap in this new story: the origin of humanity itself. If Darwin was right, and humans had evolved from ape-like ancestors, there had to be a missing link. The German term Pithecanthropus, or ape man, was the hypothetical name given to this transitional creature, the crucial fossil that would bridge the anatomical gap between modern humans and the great apes. The search for this creature was the great scientific quest of the late 19th century, but the fossil record was stubbornly silent. A few Neanderthal remains had been found in Europe, but they were often dismissed as diseased modern humans, and in any case, they were not ape-like enough to be the true ancestor. The world, it seemed, was hiding its most important fossils. Haeckel, a man who craved complete systems, found this gap intolerable. He began to speculate, as was his tendency, blending rigorous science with bold, imaginative leaps. Where would be the most logical place for this evolutionary step to have occurred? He looked at the globe, noting, like Sclater, the distribution of life. He saw the primates in Africa and the ancient civilizations of Asia, and he saw the vast Indian Ocean separating them. When he read Sclater's hypothesis of Lemuria, the solution must have struck him with the force of revelation. Sclater's sunken land bridge was not just a migratory route for small mammals. It was the perfect candidate for the lost cradle of humanity. In Haeckel's grand, sweeping vision, this was the place, the paradise of the primates, where the speechless Pithecanthropus allelus, speechless ape man, had made the profound leap into Homo sapiens. In his 1868 work, The History of Creation, Haeckel formally co-opted Sclater's idea, giving it this profound new significance. Lemuria, he argued, was the only place that made sense. Its strategic position connected the very continents that seemed most important to the human story. But Haeckel's hypothesis had another, almost poetic convenience. By proposing that this ancestral homeland had long since sunk beneath the waves, he had provided a perfect, built-in explanation for the frustrating lack of fossil evidence. The missing link was missing, Haeckel suggested, because its homeland and all the bones of its inhabitants were now resting thousands of feet beneath the Indian Ocean, forever shielded from the geologist's hammer and the archaeologist's trowel. It was an argument that was, for a time, conveniently unfalsifiable. This was the pivotal moment in our story. Lemuria had just been transformed. It was no longer a simple zoological land bridge, a mundane piece of paleogeography designed to explain lemurs. In Haeckel's powerful and popular narrative, it had become the human Eden, the single point of origin for all mankind. This was a scientific hypothesis, not a mystical one, but it was a hypothesis freighted with immense romantic and philosophical weight. Haeckel, in his desire to complete the evolutionary story, had given the world a lost human homeland. He had placed our origins in the middle of a warm, tropical sea on a continent that was now gone. This idea that a great and significant landmass, the very birthplace of our species, had vanished from the earth was profoundly evocative. It resonated with ancient flood myths and legends of a golden age. Haeckel intended to popularize Darwin, but he had unintentionally created the perfect backstory for a new spirituality. The scientific scaffold was now in place, and the mystics were about to climb it. As the 19th century entered its final decades, the scientific hypothesis of Lemuria, which had burned so brightly in the minds of men like Haeckel, was already beginning to encounter intellectual headwinds. New geological surveys, particularly those mapping the deep ocean floor, were failing to find any evidence of the vast, sunken continents that were once thought to litter the globe. The theory of isostasy, which suggested that continental crust was lighter and floated upon a denser mantle, made the idea of an entire continent sinking without a trace increasingly difficult to justify geologically. The scientific scaffolding that Sclater and Haeckel had built, while ingenious, was starting to look less like a necessary deduction and more like a convenient fiction. The concept of Lemuria was, by the 1880s, a theory in its twilight, slowly fading from mainstream scientific discourse, which was grappling with new, more complex models of the Earth's past. But as the light of science receded from the idea, a new, very different kind of illumination was about to fall upon it. The stage for this transformation was not the laboratory or the university, but the esoteric salon, the seance parlor, and the study of the professional mystic. The late 19th century was not only an age of scientific materialism, it was also, in parallel, an age of profound spiritual searching and occult revival. In the smoky, gaslit cities of Europe and America, many felt alienated by the perceived soullessness of the new industrial world and the rigid dogmas of established religion. There was a powerful hunger for a new kind of spirituality, one that could reconcile science with mysticism and that promised access to ancient, hidden wisdom. Into this fervent atmosphere stepped one of the most enigmatic and influential figures of the era, Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. A Russian noblewoman, a charismatic and polarizing figure, she was a world traveler who claimed to have spent years in Tibet and India, studying at the feet of hidden spiritual masters, or Mahatmas. In 1875, in New York City, she, along with Colonel Henry Steele Olcott, founded the Theosophical Society. This new organization had a bold, threefold mission: to foster a universal brotherhood of humanity, to encourage the comparative study of religion, philosophy, and science, and to investigate the unexplained laws of nature and the psychic powers latent in man. Theosophy was a grand synthesis, a blending of Eastern mysticism, particularly Hinduism and Buddhism, Western esotericism, and crucially, contemporary scientific theory. Blavatsky was a voracious reader, a magpie of ideas, and she was intimately familiar with the popular scientific debates of her day, including the works of Darwin, Haeckel, and Sclater. As she began to formulate her own complex, sweeping cosmology, she found herself in need of a stage upon which to place the early, forgotten chapters of human history. When she encountered Haeckel's Lemuria, his sunken cradle of humanity in the Indian Ocean, she must have recognized its immense potential. Haeckel, the materialist, had provided the location and the name of a lost human homeland, a concept already legitimized by the scientific establishment. Blavatsky, the mystic, would provide its story. With a stroke of genius, she reached into the fading pages of popular science and plucked the concept of Lemuria, adopting it as a central pillar of her new spiritual doctrine. But this was no simple adoption. It was a profound transformation. Haeckel's Lemuria was a physical land populated by speechless, evolutionary missing links. Blavatsky's Lemuria was a vast, ethereal continent, a lost paradise that had existed millions of years ago. Its inhabitants were not Haeckel's proto-humans, but the third root race of humanity, a race of spiritual, gigantic, and otherworldly beings. The scientific hypothesis, which was dying in the world of zoology, was suddenly and miraculously reborn as a foundational truth of a new global religion. It was no longer a story about lemurs. It was now a story about the very soul of man. This new story, this grand reimagining of the soul of man, was formally unveiled to the world in 1888 in Helena Blavatsky's dense and sprawling masterwork, The Secret Doctrine. This 2-volume, 1,400-page epic was not presented as her own invention, but rather as a fragmentary translation and commentary on a supposedly lost, ancient manuscript known as the Stanzas of Dzyan, which she claimed had been psychically dictated to her by the hidden spiritual masters, or Mahatmas, with whom she was in contact. The book's subtitle set its ambitious agenda: the synthesis of science, religion, and philosophy. It was Blavatsky's attempt to weave every thread of human knowledge, from Haeckel's evolutionary biology and Sclater's zoology to the symbolism of the Vedas, the Kabbalah, and Gnosticism, into a single, unified, and profoundly occult tapestry of cosmic history. At the very heart of this vast, cyclical cosmology was her doctrine of the root races. This was a vision of human evolution that dwarfed all previous conceptions, unfolding not over mere thousands of years, but over immense eons, stretching across millions, even billions of years. In Blavatsky's system, the story of humanity on Earth is the story of 7 great root races, each one a distinct evolutionary stage, a grand chapter in the development of consciousness. Each root race, she explained, emerges, dominates the globe for a vast period, and then slowly declines, giving way to the next, which evolves from its most advanced seed. These were not races in the modern ethnic sense, but fundamentally different types of humanity, experiments in form and consciousness, unfolding on continents that would themselves rise and fall in the slow geological breath of the planet. The first 2 root races, Blavatsky wrote, were so ancient and ethereal that they are almost beyond our comprehension. The first root race was composed of astral beings, formless and sexless, living on a sacred, imperishable land. The second root race, the Hyperborean, was slightly more substantial, but still non-physical in our sense, a race of golden-hued, jelly-like beings who lived on a now-vanished northern continent. These were the spiritual prototypes, the first drafts of the human form, existing in a dream state of pure spiritual awareness. But the great pivotal drama of human history, the moment that would define our entire destiny, began with the emergence of the third root race. This, Blavatsky declared, was the race that inhabited the great, lost continent of Lemuria. Here, Sclater's scientific hypothesis was transformed into a mystical stage of epic proportions. The Lemurians of the Secret Doctrine were not Haeckel's missing links, but a race of giants, their stature described as towering, perhaps 15 to 20 feet in height. Their earliest forms were still semi-ethereal, their bodies pliable and plastic, not yet solidified by the dense physical matter of our own world. They were described as having a very different sensory apparatus, one that was perfectly suited to a world where the veil between spirit and matter was still incredibly thin. In their earliest phases, Blavatsky claimed, they possessed a third eye at the back of their heads, a physical organ that in time would atrophy and recede, becoming the pineal gland, which esoteric tradition has long called the vestigial organ of spiritual sight. This third eye was not for seeing the physical world, but for perceiving the psychic and spiritual energies that flowed through all things. The Lemurians, in this phase, were essentially telepathic and clairvoyant, living in a state of intuitive, dreamlike consciousness, more akin to animals or plants in their harmonious connection to the world, yet possessing a deep, innate wisdom. They were, in Haeckel's terms, speechless, not because they were primitive, but because they had no need for the clumsy sequential logic of spoken language. Theirs was a world of direct psychic communion. This lost continent, stretching across the Indian and Pacific Oceans, was their paradise, a vast tropical world of giant ferns and strange, now extinct animals, where these gentle psychic giants roamed for millions of years. Lemuria, in Blavatsky's hands, had become the true, forgotten Eden, the homeland of a humanity that could still see the soul of the world with a single, luminous eye. The consciousness of these early Lemurians, as described in the intricate cosmology of the secret doctrine, was a reality almost impossible for the modern human mind to grasp. It was a consciousness not defined by the sharp boundaries of individuality, but by a vast oceanic sense of unity with the environment, a state of being that was more felt than thought. Their third eye, that luminous organ of spiritual sight, was not a mere anatomical curiosity. It was the very center of their perception, allowing them to see the world not as a collection of dead objects, but as a living, breathing tapestry of vital energies. They did not analyze their worlds. They communed with it, feeling the intentions of the winds, the slow thoughts of the mountains, and the life force, or prana, that pulsed within the strange, gigantic flora of their lost continent. Theirs was a world without the friction of ego, a long, slow, psychic dream lived in harmony with a world that was itself still half-dream. But this ethereal state, this psychic paradise, was not a permanent condition. In the Theosophical narrative, the grand cosmic plan required a descent into matter. The human spirit, in order to learn the lessons of the physical plane, needed a denser, more complex vehicle. Therefore, the long, multi-million-year epic of the Lemurian root race is the story of a slow, gradual fall into flesh, a deliberate condensation of the spirit into the solid world. The bodies of the Lemurians, at first so pliable and astral that they could pass through solid objects, began to thicken, to solidify. Their skeletal structures, Blavatsky wrote, were at first pliant like cartilage, only hardening over immense geological spans of time, as the very planet beneath their feet was itself cooling and condensing. This profound physical transformation brought with it the most pivotal change in human history, the mystery of reproduction. The first two root races, being formless, had reproduced through asexual means, the first by a kind of fission, the second by budding, like spores. The earliest Lemurians, in their semi-ethereal state, were said to have continued this process, but as their bodies solidified, a new, stranger method emerged, marking a crucial bridge between the spiritual and the biological. In this middle period of the Lemurian epic, the race became hermaphroditic. Each individual, these towering, dark-skinned, and often described flat-featured giants, was androgynous, containing both the male and female creative principles within a single form. They were, in a spiritual sense, complete unto themselves, a perfect, balanced unity of opposites. Their method of reproduction during this long androgynous phase is one of the most striking and peculiar tenets of the esoteric lore. They were, according to Blavatsky and her interpreters, oviparous. These giant hermaphroditic beings would produce a great egg, which was then nurtured and incubated not just by physical warmth, but by the focused, vital, and psychic energies of the parent. From this egg, a new Lemurian being would eventually emerge, ready to begin its own long cycle of life in a world that was becoming more physical by the generation. This egg-laying detail, so alien to our mammalian understanding, served as a powerful symbolic bridge connecting this ancient mythical humanity to the older reptilian and avian life forms of the planet, suggesting a world where the biological rules were still fluid, still being written. This androgynous egg-laying phase, however, was itself destined to be a transition. The cosmic plan, according in the doctrine, required a further descent, a division that would create the friction necessary for the birth of the intellect. Thus, in the later ages of Lemuria, the separation of the sexes occurred. This was not a slow evolutionary drift, but a profound and distinct event in the spiritual history of the race. The unified hermaphroditic form split, and humanity for the very first time became male and female. In the Theosophical interpretation, this, not the eating of an apple, was the true fall of man, not a moral sin, but a planned, necessary descent into duality, the very event that would allow for individual self-consciousness. With this separation came a new sexual form of reproduction, and with it, the birth of desire, attachment, and the ego. The intuitive, all-seeing third eye, its purpose as the primary organ of a unified consciousness now fading, began to atrophy. It slowly receded, buried deep within the skull to become the pineal gland, while the two forward-facing physical eyes opened wide, ready to perceive a new world of separation, of self and other, the world of material reality that we have inhabited ever since. With the separation of the sexes and the dimming of the inner spiritual third eye, the great Lemurian race, now fully anchored in the dense world of physical matter, entered its final and most dramatic epoch. Their new two-eyed vision, focused outward, revealed a world of stunning material beauty and complexity, a world of objects to be measured, manipulated, and possessed. The intuitive, dreamlike consciousness that had once united them with the soul of all things began to fade, replaced by the sharp, new, and dangerous tool of the intellect. In theosophical lore, this intellect was not a natural, slow evolution. It was a gift, a spark of mind or manas, bestowed upon the now physical but still mindless Lemurians by a group of highly advanced spiritual beings, the Lords of the Flame, who were said to have come from Venus to accelerate human evolution. This awakening of the mind was the final step in the descent into matter, and it was a double-edged sword, bringing with it both the capacity for reason and the potential for ego. For a time, this new, intellectually awakened race is said to have lived in a kind of golden age. They were still giants, possessing immense physical strength and a residual, if fading, connection to the psychic forces of the planet. They became, in this narrative, the first great builders of the physical world. The lore describes them as erecting vast, cyclopean cities, their architecture built on a scale that would dwarf our own. These were not cities of delicate spires, but of monolithic stone, structures built from enormous blocks of basalt, lava, and granite, hewn and lifted not just by brute force, but by a lingering instinctual mastery over the laws of sound and vibration. They piled mountains upon mountains, carving the very landscape of their vast continent, which Blavatsky described as stretching from the Indian Ocean, enveloping Madagascar, Australia, and extending far into the Pacific, a truly colossal landmass. But this mastery over the physical world, this newfound power of the intellect, soon led to the spiritual decay that is the hallmark of all such myths of a lost paradise. The fall, which had begun with the separation of the sexes, was completed by the arrogance of the mind. A faction of the Lemurians, the narrative continues, turned away from the guidance of their spiritual kings and began to focus solely on material pursuits. They used their immense psychic powers not for communion, but for control. They became sorcerers, not sages, delving into the darker, more selfish applications of their power, seeking to dominate both nature and their fellow beings. The unity of the earlier Lemurian dream state was shattered, replaced by the warring factions of a race that had learned the concepts of I and mine. This spiritual corruption, this profound shift from unity to selfishness, is described as the great sin of the Lemurians. In the secret doctrine, this sin is also given a strange biological dimension. It is written that in their moral decline, they began to mingle with the less evolved, more animalistic beings that still populated the world, an act that was considered a defilement of the new divine spark of human intellect. This miscegenation, in Blavatsky's 19th century terminology, was said to have produced strange, monstrous, and subhuman creatures, polluting the pure human stock. This, the doctrine asserts, was the true origin of the ape-like creatures that science, in its ignorance, was just beginning to discover in the fossil record. The apes, in this view, were not our ancestors. They were the degenerate, soulless descendants of this great Lemurian sin. A paradise so profoundly corrupted could not, in the karmic logic of the cosmos, be allowed to endure. The very earth itself, which the Lemurians had once communed with, now rose against them. The cataclysm that ended Lemuria was not a single, sudden event, but a slow, grinding, and inevitable geological cleansing. The continent, which had been the stage for this grand experiment in consciousness, was doomed. The process of its sinking was said to have lasted for an immense period, a long, terrifying twilight for the third root race. Great volcanic chains, which had long slept, awoke in chains of fire, tearing the fabric of the land. The skies darkened with ash, and the sun, once a source of life, became a blood-red memory. Earthquakes shook their monolithic cities, toppling the proud towers built by their sorcerer kings. And slowly, inexorably, the great warm waters of the ocean began to rise, reclaiming the continent inch by inch, century by century. The vast landmass of Lemuria began to break apart. Australia and Madagascar, once parts of its interior, were left behind as isolated fragments. The population of giants was decimated, their cities washed clean, their knowledge lost beneath the waves. This was not a punishment from an angry god, but the impersonal, just working of karma, the balancing of a cosmic scale that had been tipped too far toward materialism. A small seed of the race, the most spiritually pure and advanced of the Lemurians, was said to have been saved led by the spiritual Mahatmas, to a new, safe land in Central Asia, where they would wait in hiding for the waters to recede, ready to become the progenitors of the next great chapter, the fourth root race, the Atlanteans. The rest of Lemuria, and its millions of spiritually compromised inhabitants, vanished, leaving behind only a great, silent ocean and a myth that would one day be known as the Flood. Helena Blavatsky had provided the grand, sweeping, and often enigmatic outline of this lost world, a vast cosmological drama painted in the broadest of strokes, dictated as she claimed by hidden masters. But her death in 1891 did not signal the end of the Theosophical project. It merely passed the torch to a new generation of leaders, mystics, and organizers who would take her dense, complex secret doctrine and expand upon its mysteries, popularizing and, in many cases, vividly elaborating its claims. The foundation had been laid, but the intricate floor plan, the detailed architecture, and the precise geography of this sunken world were yet to be drawn. The human imagination, once given a lost continent, craves a map. It desires to trace the coastlines, to name the mountains, and to pinpoint the cities now sleeping in the abyssal depths. This task of mapping the invisible fell to a prominent theosophist named William Scott Elliot. He was not a geologist, nor an archaeologist, but an English merchant, and more importantly, a devoted student of Blavatsky's teachings. He, like others in the Theosophical leadership, particularly the prolific and controversial writer Charles Webster Leadbeater, claimed to possess a remarkable non-physical skill. This was the power of astral clairvoyance, a trained psychic ability that they asserted allowed them to peer backward in time. They believed they could directly access what Theosophy called the Akashic Records, a metaphysical, indestructible library, an energetic imprint on the astral plane that held a perfect, detailed record of every event, thought, and form that had ever existed on Earth. In this view, history was not a collection of fragmented texts and half-buried stones. It was a living film that one could, with the proper spiritual training, simply watch. Using this supposed psychic sight, Scott Elliot set out to do what no mundane scientist ever could, to chart the precise geography of Lemuria. His findings were published in a series of articles, and later, in 1896, in a slim but profoundly influential book titled The Story of Atlantis and the Lost Lemuria. This work, often published with a preface by the Theosophical leader Annie Besant, was presented as a factual, detailed historical and geographical account, a work of non-fiction based on this clairvoyant research. It was here that Lemuria, which for Blavatsky had been a somewhat shifting and symbolic landmass, was given its definitive, concrete form. Scott Elliot, acting as a spiritual cartographer, unfurled the maps of a world millions of years lost. The continent he described and mapped was a colossus, an enormous, sprawling landmass that truly dominated the globe during its eon. It was not, as Sclater had first imagined, a simple bridge across the Indian Ocean. In Scott Elliot's vision, Lemuria was a vast, roughly horseshoe-shaped continent centered on the equator. It stretched from the eastern coast of Africa, engulfing Madagascar, and swept eastward across the Indian Ocean to include modern-day Sri Lanka and the Indian Peninsula. From there, it continued, so enveloping Southeast Asia, the islands of Indonesia, and crucially, it included Australia and New Zealand, not as separate entities, but as mere mountainous regions within its own vast interior. Its great arms then reached far into the Pacific Ocean, with some of its peaks and highlands, according to this occult geography, still jutting above the waves today as the scattered islands of Polynesia, including most famously the remote and mysterious Easter Island. These maps, which were drawn by a professional geographer based on Scott Elliott's clairvoyant descriptions, were printed in his book and gave a stunning visual legitimacy to the myth. They showed the world at different successive stages, depicting Lemuria first in its prime and then in the long, agonizing stages of its cataclysmic breakup as the seas rose and the land subsided. He not only mapped its coasts, but also described its environment. It was a land of immense, steaming jungles, of giant tree ferns and colossal flowers, a humid, tropical world befitting the gigantic race that inhabited it. He spoke of its fauna, of strange, dinosaur-like reptiles and enormous, now extinct mammals that roamed its plains. He was, in essence, painting a picture of the Mesozoic or early Cenozoic era as understood by 19th century paleontology and confidently labeling it Lemuria. He did not stop at geography. His psychic readings also provided intricate new details about the Lemurians themselves. He described their social structures, their cities, and their technology. He affirmed Blavatsky's claim of their gigantic stature and their third eye, but added practical details. Their cities, he wrote, were built of cyclopean blocks of stone with sloping, inward-leaning walls designed to withstand the earth-shattering volcanic activity that was common on the continent. He described their strange, flight-capable airships, which he claimed were not mechanical, but were powered by an ethereal force, a kind of personal vril or psychic energy that allowed them to navigate the skies. He elaborated on their social decline, describing in detail their inhuman practices and their governance by sorcerer kings who had turned from the light. Scott Elliott, through his maps and his detailed clairvoyant reports, had successfully transformed Blavatsky's dense, philosophical myth into a tangible, illustrated, and deeply compelling lost world adventure, a story so detailed you could almost believe you could sail a ship to its coordinates, if only you could travel back 1,000,000 years in time. The very title of William Scott Elliott's 1896 book, The Story of Atlantis and the Lost Lemuria, reveals an essential truth of this evolving mythology. Lemuria, even as it was being meticulously mapped and described, did not enter the public imagination as a solitary concept. It arrived on the esoteric stage to find that the role of great lost continent was already occupied by an older, more famous, and far more celebrated protagonist. This, of course, was Atlantis. The story of Lemuria, from the moment of its mystical rebirth, became inextricably intertwined with this rival narrative, becoming not a replacement, but a prequel, a necessary chapter 1 in a grand two-part epic of lost worlds. To understand what Lemuria became, we must first look to the shadow cast by its mighty Atlantic counterpart, a legend that had held the Western mind captive for millennia. The story of Atlantis begins not with 19th century zoologists or occult mystics, but with the cool, rational prose of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. In his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BC, Plato tells a story which he presents as a genuine historical account passed down from Egyptian priests. It is the tale of a magnificent island kingdom, larger than Libya and Asia combined, located in the Atlantic Ocean, just beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the Straits of Gibraltar. This kingdom, Atlantis, was a marvel of engineering, a utopia of concentric rings of land and water, ruled by wise philosopher kings who were descended from the sea god Poseidon. But this perfect society, blessed with immense wealth and power, inevitably fell victim to the great flaw of all human endeavors, hubris. The Atlanteans, their divine nature diluted by mortal desires, became warlike and corrupt, launching an unprovoked invasion against Athens and the Mediterranean world. In the end, their arrogance incurred divine wrath, and in a single terrible day and night of misfortune, the entire continent of Atlantis was swallowed by the sea, vanishing beneath the waves. For most of history, Plato's story was treated as exactly what it almost certainly was: a philosophical allegory, a noble lie, crafted to explore themes of political corruption, divine justice, and the ideal state. It was a moral fable, not a geography lesson. But in the 19th century, this ancient tale was exhumed and given a dramatic new life. In 1882, a charismatic American congressman and pseudoscientist named Ignatius Donnelly published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. This book, a massive bestseller, took Plato's story as literal, historical fact. Donnelly marshaled a vast, eclectic array of evidence, from flood myths around the world to the then inexplicable similarities between Egyptian and Mayan pyramids, to argue that Atlantis was not just a lost civilization, but the mother civilization, the single common ancestor of all great ancient cultures. It was Donnelly who truly popularized the idea of Atlantis as a real, sunken, high-tech paradise, the source of all human wisdom. When Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophists began constructing their own grand cosmology, they did not ignore this already popular phenomenon. They embraced it. Ignatius Donnelly, the populist, had provided the what and where. Theosophy would provide the why. In the secret doctrine, Atlantis was seamlessly integrated into the great cycle of the root races. Just as the third root race had been the Lemurians, the fourth root race, Blavatsky declared, was the Atlantean. They were the direct descendants of that seed of the Lemurians, who had been saved from their sinking Pacific continent and led to a new land that had risen in the Atlantic. This new race was destined to perfect the very faculty that the Lemurians had only just begun to develop, the analytical intellect. Thus, a clear evolutionary and narrative line was drawn. The Lemurians were the intuitive, psychic, dreamlike giants of the dawning of consciousness. The Atlanteans were their brilliant, technological, and dangerously intellectual children. Where the Lemurians were described as using their third eye to commune with nature, the Atlanteans were said to have harnessed its fading power, combining it with their intellect to manipulate the hidden forces of the universe. They were, in the Theosophical narrative, the masters of a mysterious energy force called Vril, which powered their sophisticated airships, the Vimanas, their cities, and their terrible weapons. They were a race of scientific geniuses who had achieved a level of technology that, the Theosophists claimed, far surpassed our own. But just as the Lemurians fell through their descent into material selfishness, the Atlanteans fell through the active, malevolent abuse of their intellectual and psychic power. Theirs was a more dramatic and modern sin. The Atlantean civilization, the lore describes, split into two warring factions. The sons of the law of one, a spiritual minority who remained loyal to the divine plan, and the sons of Belial, a powerful, materialistic majority of dark sorcerers who used their advanced technology and vril-powered magic for conquest, decadence, and control. This great million-year war between the white and black magicians of Atlantis forms the core of its esoteric legend, a drama of cosmic struggle that culminated in a cataclysm far more sudden and violent than the slow sinking of Lemuria. Their final hubristic misuse of their power, the story goes, created a massive, planet-altering explosion, shattering their continent and sending it to the bottom of the ocean in the great deluge that would be remembered in the collective memory of humanity as the Great Flood. In this way, the two myths no longer competed. They complemented each other perfectly. Lemuria was the lost, ancient homeland of the soul, a story of our slow, innocent fall into matter. Atlantis was the lost homeland of the intellect, a story of our tragic, brilliant fall into hubris. Together, they formed a complete alternative history of the human spirit, a vast, prehistoric stage for the drama of our evolution, setting the scene for our own current fifth root race, the Aryan, which Blavatsky said had begun with the survivors of the final Atlantean flood. Lemuria was the forgotten paradise. Atlantis was the legendary catastrophe. While the myth of Atlantis, rooted in Plato's clear, if allegorical description, was firmly anchored in the Atlantic Ocean, the realm of Lemuria was, by its very nature, more sprawling, more ancient, and more deeply submerged in both the ocean and in prehistory. Its heart, the very nucleus of the legend, was always the vast, warm, and comparatively mysterious expanse of the Indian Ocean. This was the ocean that had first posed the scientific riddle. This was the great blue void on 19th century maps that seemed to separate rather than connect, the great cradles of early life and civilization in Africa and Asia. It was in this specific ocean that Philip Sclater had first needed to build his intellectual bridge, and it was here that the Theosophists, following his lead, would lay the foundations for their own lost paradise, a continent that was the mother of all others. The problem, as Sclater had seen it, was Madagascar. This great island, a world in miniature, with its unique, almost alien ecosystems, was the central clue. It was populated by the lemurs, yet separated from their primate relatives in Africa and their fossilized cousins in India. The Theosophical mythmakers, absorbing this scientific puzzle, provided a beautifully simple and epic solution. Madagascar was not, and had never been, a mere island. It was, in their clairvoyantly accessed history, one of the last and highest remaining fragments of the Lemurian motherland, a mountainous plateau of the ancient continent that had stubbornly refused to sink when the rest of the landmass was reclaimed by the sea. The lemurs, in this view, were not mysterious migrants who had crossed an impossible ocean. They were simply the survivors, the last living inhabitants of a lost world, left marooned on the surviving peak of their original home. From this Malagasy fortress, the mythic continent in its prime was said to have stretched eastward, forging a solid, continuous land bridge to the Indian subcontinent. The southern peninsula of modern-day India was not a peninsula at all, but was itself an integrated part of this vaster Lemurian landmass. This, the occult lore explained, was the reason for the uncanny biological affinities between these two now distant lands. It explained the fossils Sclater had puzzled over, and it also provided a new, mystical context for the deep, ancient cultures of India. The Vedas, the Puranas, the great Hindu epics that spoke of immense cycles of time, or yugas, and of gods and heroes in a world that long predated modern history, were seen by Theosophists not as mere myths, but as the fragmented, half-remembered folk memories of the Lemurian and early Atlantean epics. The very soil of India, in this esoteric view, was part of that sacred, sunken land. But the realm of Lemuria, in its full theosophical conception, did not stop at India. It was a true supercontinent, far larger than Sclater's original, more modest bridge. The maps drawn by William Scott Elliott, based on his psychic readings, showed this landmass continuing its eastward sprawl, incorporating all of what we now call Southeast Asia. The great archipelagos of Indonesia and the Philippines were not, in that distant age, chains of scattered islands, but were like Madagascar, the volcanic, mountainous spines of a continuous, single territory. The shallow, warm seas of the Sunda Shelf were in that age vast, steaming inland plains and jungles. This land, this contiguous world, then stretched southward to envelop the entire continent of Australia and even reached as far as New Zealand. Australia, in this narrative, was not the isolated, down-under continent of unique marsupials, but was simply a vast, dry plateau in the southern interior of Greater Lemuria. This immense single landmass, covering the entire Indian Ocean and much of the early Pacific, was the grand stage for the third root race. It was a tropical, hothouse world, a realm of giant ferns, strange, towering flora, and a climate that was uniformly warm and humid, existing before the ice ages had brought their great chill to the planet. This geography was not just incidental, it was essential to the story. It provided the necessary, isolated cradle for this grand experiment in consciousness. It was a world large enough to contain millions of years of evolution, a single, connected ecosystem where the gigantic telepathic Lemurians could live and evolve in relative isolation, their drama of the third eye and the descent into matter playing out undisturbed on a global stage that was all their own. When this continent finally met its doom, its slow, fiery, and watery end, this geography is what made the story so poignant. The sinking did not happen all at once, but in great, successive stages. The land tore apart, the sea rushing in to create the oceans and seas we know today. The Indian Ocean, in this myth, is therefore not just an ocean, it is a graveyard. Beneath its blue, sunlit surface lies the forgotten motherland of humanity, the great, silent cities of the third root race, and the scattered lands that were left behind, Madagascar, India, Australia, and the thousands of islands of the Malay archipelago became the lonely, haunted monuments to this lost world, their strange, shared biology the last, whispering testimony of a time when the world was one. As the Theosophical Society, through the clairvoyant maps of William Scott Elliott, was painstakingly charting the vast, submerged coastlines of Lemuria across the Indian Ocean, a parallel legend was quietly taking root, a story that would soon become a source of profound confusion, a mythological echo that would blur the boundaries of this lost world. The name of this new, rival continent was Mu. While its story begins not with the distribution of primates, nor with the grand, cyclical cosmology of Russian mystics, but in the humid, mosquito-plagued jungles of the Yucatan Peninsula, in the mind of a brilliant, eccentric, and deeply obsessive 19th century antiquarian named Augustus Le Plongeon. A French-American photographer and amateur archaeologist, Le Plongeon had become utterly enthralled by the ruins of the ancient Maya civilization, which were at the time just beginning to be seriously studied. Le Plongeon and his wife, Alice, spent years documenting the great stone cities of Chichen Itza and Uxmal, taking thousands of photographs and developing a profound, if deeply unorthodox, affinity for the Mayan culture. He was not a dispassionate scholar. He was a man possessed by an idea. He believed with fervent conviction that the Maya were not a New World civilization at all, but were in fact the mother culture of the entire globe, the source from which both the ancient Egyptians and all other great civilizations had sprung. This was a popular pseudo-historical trope, mirroring Ignatius Donnelly's arguments for Atlantis, but Le Plongeon sought a different homeland. He believed he had found the proof, not in geology or biology, but in the Mayan hieroglyphs themselves. In the 1870s, Le Plongeon claimed to have achieved what no mainstream scholar had: a complete translation of a section of a rare Mayan manuscript known as the Truano Codex, now understood to be part of the larger Madrid Codex. His translation was not based on the rigorous linguistic methods that would one day crack the Mayan code, but on a highly creative, symbolic, and deeply subjective process, essentially seeing in the glyphs what he already wished to find. And what he claimed to have found was a dramatic, tragic story. The Codex, he asserted, told the history of a great, ancient island continent, located not in the Indian Ocean, but in the Atlantic, which had been the true homeland of the Maya. This continent, he declared, was named Mu. He recounted a dramatic tale of two royal siblings, Prince Ko and Princess Mu, whose rivalry led to a great war and the ultimate destruction of their homeland. According to his reading of the glyphs, the continent of Mu was destroyed by a terrible cataclysm of volcanoes and earthquakes, sinking beneath the waves in a single, fiery catastrophe, an event he dated precisely to 9,836 years before his time. The survivors, he claimed, fled in two directions. Queen Mu sailed east to Egypt, where she became the goddess Isis and founded the pharaonic civilization, while others fled west to the Yucatan, where they founded the great Mayan cities as a memorial to their lost motherland. Le Plongeon's theories were, even in the enthusiastic 19th century, considered fantastical. They were summarily rejected by the small but growing community of professional Mesoamerican scholars. His translations were shown to have no linguistic basis, and his grand, transoceanic narrative was seen as pure, unsupported speculation. The name Mu and its associated story might have vanished into the footnotes of pseudo-archaeology, a curious but forgotten obsession, but it was not to be. The name Mu, like Lemuria before it, was too evocative to be left unused. It was a name that had been heard, and it was about to be absorbed into a far grander system. Helena Blavatsky, in the process of composing her secret doctrine, was a master synthesizer, a weaver of disparate threads. She had already adopted Sclater's Lemuria and Donnelly's Atlantis. When she encountered Le Plongeon's Mu, she did not see it as a rival theory, but as a corroboration. She concluded that Le Plongeon, in his own flawed and literal way, had stumbled upon a fragment of the true ancient story. In her view, the Mu that the Troano Codex supposedly described was simply the Mayan name for the great continent of the third root race, the very same landmass she was already calling Lemuria. In The Secret Doctrine, Blavatsky begins to use the names Lemuria and Mu almost interchangeably. She saw no contradiction. For her, Lemuria was the modern scientific name coined by Sclater. Mu was the ancient traditional name, preserved in the fragmented memories of its descendants, the Maya. This act of conflation, this blending of two entirely separate pseudo-historical narratives, is the source of the Mu controversy. By adopting the name Mu, Blavatsky and her followers also implicitly absorbed some of its geography. Le Plongeon's Mu, while he placed it in the Atlantic, was tied explicitly to the Maya of Central America on the Pacific side of the world. This helped justify the Theosophical expansion of Lemuria out of its original Indian Ocean cradle and deep into the Pacific, as Scott Elliott's maps would later show. This created a tangled, often confusing mythological legacy. For decades to come, Lemuria and Mu would be used as synonyms by many in the esoteric community, both referring to the same vast sunken Pacific Indian Ocean continent of the third root race. This confusion, however, also left the door open for another possibility. If they were the same, the story was unified. But if they were not the same, then the name Mu, now severed from Le Plongeon's specific Mayan narrative and imbued with theosophical significance, was available to be picked up, dusted off, and given a new, independent life, a life that would rival both Lemuria and Atlantis. The name Mu, once rescued from the academic obscurity of Augustus Le Plongeon and fused by Helena Blavatsky to her vaster Lemurian continent, now hung in the esoteric air of the early 20th century, a name pregnant with mystery and ripe for a new prophet. This prophet would arrive not from the ranks of Theosophy, nor from the halls of science, but in the person of James Churchward, a figure who seemed to blend the romantic archetype of the British colonial adventurer with the passionate certainty of a true believer. Churchward, who styled himself a colonel, was a traveler, an inventor, and a writer, a man who, like many of his time, was deeply fascinated by the concept of a single, lost mother culture that could explain all the disparate wonders of the ancient world, from the pyramids of Egypt to the statues of Easter Island. Churchward's story, which he would begin to popularize in the 1920s with his book The Lost Continent of Mu, did not rely on the clairvoyant, astral Akashic records of the Theosophists. Instead, he based his claims on a far more tangible, if equally unverifiable, foundation, a direct, textual discovery. He claimed that as a young officer serving in India during the 1880s, he had befriended a high-ranking Hindu priest, a rishi, at a temple school. This priest, after long and patient persuasion, eventually revealed to Churchward a set of secret, forgotten tablets, hidden for millennia within the temple vaults. These were not clay tablets like those of Mesopotamia, but were, in Churchward's telling, sacred, sun-baked records written by an ancient, forgotten brotherhood known as the Knuckles. This, Churchward declared, was his Rosetta Stone to a lost world. With the Rishi's guidance, he claimed to have learned the long-dead language of these Nakal brothers, a symbolic proto-language which he asserted was the original tongue of all mankind. The tablets, he said, told a story that predated all known history. They spoke of the true, original homeland of humanity, a vast, gentle, and profoundly advanced civilization that had flourished for tens of thousands of years. The name of this motherland, the tablets revealed, was Mu. This was the moment of schism in our legend. Churchward, by claiming a primary textual source, effectively stole the name Mu back from the Theosophists, severing it from Blavatsky's Lemuria and giving it a new, independent, and geographically distinct identity. Churchward's Mu was not the sprawling, horseshoe-shaped landmass of Scott Elliot that linked to Africa, India, and Australia. Instead, Churchward placed his continent squarely and definitively in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. This was a true Pacific empire, an immense, singular landmass that, in his estimation, stretched for thousands of miles from the northern islands of Hawaii, which were part of its territory, southward past Fiji and Easter Island. It was, in his vision, a vast rolling plain, a tropical paradise of luxuriant vegetation and waving palms, a Garden of Eden that was not a metaphor but a real geological place. The scattered, sun-drenched islands of modern Polynesia were in his narrative nothing more than the last, highest peaks of this great drowned continent, the lonely, windswept tombstones of a forgotten world. The inhabitants of this Pacific paradise were also radically different from the Theosophical Lemurians. Churchward's knuckles were not 15-foot tall, hermaphroditic, egg-laying giants with a third eye. They were us. They were Homo sapiens, a highly evolved and civilized race of humans, divided into 10 tribes who lived in great unfortified cities across their peaceful land, which they called the Empire of the Sun. Churchward's Mu was not a primitive cradle of half-formed beings. It was a fully fledged utopian society, spiritually and technologically advanced, that had mastered science, art, and a pure monotheistic religion. This, he argued, was the single source of all human culture. The great ancient civilizations of Egypt, of India, of the Maya, and the Babylonians were not independent developments. They were merely the colonial outposts of Mu, degenerate, far-flung copies established by Nakal missionaries and seafarers tens of thousands of years before the Great Cataclysm. The end of this idyllic world in Churchward's story was also distinct. It was not the slow, karmic sinking of Lemuria, a gradual subsidence over eons. The end of Mu was a singular, terrifying, and geologically specific apocalypse. He described how the entire continent rested upon a vast, unstable network of underground gas-filled caverns. In a final catastrophic day, these caverns collapsed. The foundations of the land gave way, and the entire continent of Mu, with its 64 million inhabitants, plunged into the fiery abyss, swallowed by the boiling, hissing waters of the Pacific. The ocean, he wrote, rolled in and formed a watery grave. This new, competing, and highly detailed narrative, propelled by Churchward's popular and vividly illustrated books, created a profound and lasting confusion. Now there were two great sunken motherlands, Lemuria in the Indian Ocean and Mu in the Pacific, with overlapping geographies and names, but entirely different stories, inhabitants, and fates, both vying for the same crown as the one true cradle of humanity. The esoteric marketplace of the late 19th and early 20th centuries was now crowded with sunken kingdoms. There was Sclater's original scientific Lemuria in the Indian Ocean, a biological bridge for lemurs. There was Blavatsky's grand mystical Lemuria, a Pacific and Indian Ocean hybrid, the vast million-year-old homeland of the psychic, giant third root race. There was Plato's and Donnelly's Atlantis, the brilliant, hubristic, and technological empire in the Atlantic, the domain of the fourth root race. And now there was Churchward's Mu, a new, competing Pacific paradise of enlightened, human-sized knockalls. These stories, all born in the same fertile era of scientific discovery and spiritual hunger, began to overlap, blend, and compete in the public imagination, their geographies and timelines becoming hopelessly, wonderfully entangled. But for all their epic scope, these legends shared one significant feature. They were all lost. Their cities were at the bottom of the sea, their inhabitants long dead or ascended to other planes. They were stories of the deep past, accessible only through ancient, contested texts or the rare psychic gift of astral clairvoyance. They offered a profound, alternative history for humanity, but they offered little in the way of immediate, tangible contact. The myth, in order to survive and thrive in a new century, needed to do more than just explain the past. It needed to inhabit the present. It needed a new home, not in a distant, inaccessible ocean, but somewhere real, somewhere tangible, somewhere you could point to on a map. And so, in one of the strangest and most powerful migrations in the history of mythology, the story of the lost continents mysteriously leaped from the abyssal depths of the ocean and attached itself with stunning specificity to a single, magnificent, and silent mountain in Northern California. This was Mount Shasta, a colossal dormant volcano, its twin peaks perpetually crowned in snow and ice. Shasta dominates the landscape for 100 miles, a solitary, massive beacon of white against the green forests and blue skies of the Siskiyou Range. It is a place of profound, palpable silence, of strange, lens-shaped lenticular clouds that form on its summit like celestial crowns, and of an undeniable, numinous presence. Long before any New Age spirituality, it was, and remains, a profoundly sacred place to the Native American tribes of the region, such as the Modoc, Shasta, and Pit River peoples, who have for millennia seen it as a center of the world, a place of creation, and the home of powerful spirits. This mountain, already steeped in native legend, was the perfect, empty vessel for a new myth. The process began not with Lemuria, but with its old rival Atlantis. In 1894, a young man from Eureka, California, named Frederick Spencer Oliver, published a most unusual book titled A Dweller on Two Planets. He claimed the book was not his own work, but had been channeled or amanuensed in his youth from a Tibetan spiritual master named Philos, who was recounting his past lives in Atlantis. The book was a dense, fantastical narrative, blending theosophical concepts of karma and reincarnation with a wild science fiction vision of Atlantis. But it contained one crucial new detail. Philos described how a small, elite group of Atlantean survivors, foreseeing their continent's doom, had fled. He described them building a refuge and a great temple inside the hollowed-out interior of Mount Shasta, complete with advanced technology, including airships and crystal-powered energy. This was the spark. Oliver's book had for the first time localized the lost civilization myth, bringing it from the Atlantic to a specific American landmark. But the myth was still fluid. In the 1930s, This Shasta narrative was picked up and amplified by Guy Ballard, the founder of the I Am movement. Ballard claimed that he personally had hiked on Mount Shasta and met face to face the ascended master Saint Germain, a being who, in Theosophical lore, was a key figure in the spiritual hierarchy. Ballard's movement, which became immensely popular, synthesized Theosophical ideas and firmly established Mount Shasta as a primary power point on the globe, a physical world headquarters for the Great White Brotherhood of Ascended Masters. It was in this fertile spiritual soil of the I Am movement and the subsequent New Age thought that the final, crucial conflation occurred. As these new beliefs were synthesized, the gentler, more ancient, and more spiritually pure myth of Lemuria began to be favored over the more morally ambiguous, hubristic, and warlike Atlantean narrative. The story of the mountain's hidden inhabitants was retold, and in this retelling, they were no longer Atlanteans, they were Lemurians. The story became this: thousands of years ago, perhaps 12,000 or more, as the great continent of Lemuria, or Mu, was beginning its final, watery cataclysm, a group of the most spiritually evolved Lemurians, an elite of sages and scientists, enacted a plan. They used their mastery of energy, vibration, and hyperdimensional technology to travel from their sinking homeland, bringing their most sacred records and their purest genetic stock. They identified Mount Shasta as a place of immense power and safety. There, deep within the earth, they used their ancient science to construct a vast subterranean city of light, a utopian refuge, safe from the floods and the wars of the surface world that was descending into barbarism. The lost continent was no longer lost. It had simply moved indoors. The refuge that the Lemurian survivors were said to have built deep within Mount Shasta could not remain a mere abstract hiding place for long. As the 20th century mythos of the mountain grew, nourished by the I Am movement and the burgeoning New Age philosophies of California, this hidden sanctuary was given a name, a detailed architecture, and a profound ongoing purpose. In this new, evolving chapter of the legend, the city inside the mountain was named Telos. The name itself was a deliberate and symbolic choice, drawn from the ancient Greek word telos, which means end or purpose, signifying that this city was not just a final refuge, but the very purpose of the Lemurian journey, the place where its highest ideals would be preserved to their ultimate end, awaiting a time of planetary rebirth. This was no dark, damp cavern, no simple network of tunnels dug by desperate refugees. The city of Telos, as described in the growing lore of the mountain, was a vast, self-contained, and perfectly engineered biosphere, a multi-leveled metropolis of light existing within the great, hollowed-out dome of the dormant volcano. It was said to be a city of 5 distinct levels, each with its own function, descending deep into the roots of the mountain. The primary level, just beneath the mountain's crust, was the heart of the city, a place of stunning beauty, housing the main temples, the administrative centers, and the homes of the majority of its inhabitants. Deeper levels were reserved for advanced manufacturing, hydroponic gardens that fed the entire population, and centers of scientific and esoteric learning. The architecture of Telos was described not as cyclopean blocks of stone, like those of its ancient surface world ancestors, but as a living crystalline structure. The buildings were said to be grown, not built, their forms harmonious, seamless, and flowing, glowing with their own soft, internal light. The entire city was illuminated not by fire or electricity, but by a great central sun, a massive, specially attuned crystal suspended in the apex of the city's dome, which radiated a full spectrum, life-giving light that mimicked the gentle, nourishing glow of the sun, creating a perpetual springtime atmosphere. This light fueled the lush parks, the clear, flowing streams, and the vibrant, rainbow-hued flowers that were said to line every walkway, filling the air with a delicate, unknown fragrance. The inhabitants of this hidden utopia, the Telosians, were no longer the lumbering 15-foot-tall giants of Blavatsky's imagining. They were, in this perfected narrative, the idolized descendants of Lemuria, tall, graceful, and physically perfect human beings who had, through their spiritual purity and advanced science, completely conquered the ravages of age and disease. They were said to live for thousands of years, their bodies remaining in a state of youthful prime, their minds dedicated to the peaceful pursuit of art, music, meditation, and the study of the cosmic laws. They were a society without conflict, without a monetary system, without a government in the human sense, living in a state of telepathic, harmonious accord, their every need provided for by the city's crystal-based, zero-point energy technology. Their purpose in this mythology was one of immense planetary significance. They were not just survivors, they were guardians. They were the keepers of the true history of the earth, the sacred records of Lemuria, Mu, and Atlantis, which they had preserved on indestructible crystal plates, or Talos plates. They were said to be the active stewards of the mountain's immense spiritual energy, holding the planet in balance and silently guiding the evolution of the surface dwellers, our own chaotic, amnesiac civilization, toward a future great awakening. They were, in essence, the ascended masters of the I Am movement, given a specific, physical, if hidden, address. This new layer of the legend provided a perfect, all-encompassing explanation for the many mysteries of the mountain. The strange, lens-shaped clouds that so often wreathe Shasta's peak were not, in this view, mere meteorological phenomena. They were cloaking devices, ethereal camouflage for the silver, silent light ships, or Merkabahs that the Telosians used to enter and exit their city. The occasional, unexplained lights seen flickering on the slopes were the glow of their energy systems. The reports from hikers of tall, graceful, robed figures who would appear silently on the trail and then vanish were no longer ghosts or hallucinations. They were the benign, beautiful inhabitants of Talos, the gentle Lemurians themselves, venturing out on some quiet, unknown mission. The lost continent of Lemuria, which had begun as a scientific solution to the riddle of a small primate, had completed its journey. It was no longer a vague, sunken memory in a distant ocean. It was a living, breathing crystal city of immortal sages, hidden just beneath the snows of a Californian volcano, waiting patiently for the day when we, their lost children, would finally be ready to come home. While the myth of Lemuria was blossoming in the warm, spiritual climes of California, establishing its crystal cities within the sacred, silent heart of Mount Shasta, the world of mundane science, the very world that had first given the lost continent its name, was undergoing a profound and tectonic revolution. The 19th century scientific consensus, which had been the fertile soil for Sclater's hypothesis, was built on a foundational assumption that the continents were fixed, static, and permanent, locked in their positions since the dawn of time. It was this very fixist model that had created the need for land bridges. There was simply no other way to explain the strange, transoceanic distribution of life. But even as the mystics of Telos were describing their crystal-powered airships, a German meteorologist and geophysicist, armed with a simple map and a revolutionary idea, was preparing to tear that assumption apart. This man was Alfred Wegener, and the idea, which he first began to formulate around 1910 and formally published in 1915, was called continental drift. Wegener was not an occultist, nor was he searching for lost civilizations. He was, like Sclater, a meticulous observer of the natural world, and he was struck by a simple, almost childlike observation. The continents looked as though they fit together, like the scattered pieces of a single, giant jigsaw puzzle. He stared at the great curving S of the Atlantic Ocean, noting how the bulge of eastern South America seemed to fit perfectly, almost uncannily, into the great concave bight of western Africa. This was an observation others had made before, but for Wegener, it was not a mere coincidence. It was the clue, the starting point of a radical new history of the Earth. Wegener did not stop at the map's geometry. He began to gather, with the obsessive energy of a true convert, a vast and multidisciplinary array of evidence. He pointed to the fossil record. He noted that the remains of identical, small, land-based reptiles from the Permian period, such as Mesosaurus, were found in the rock strata of both southern Africa and Brazil, and nowhere else in the world. He tracked the distribution of an ancient fern, Glossopteris, finding its fossils scattered across the now disparate lands of South America, Africa, India, Australia, and even Antarctica. These were land-based plants and freshwater animals. They could not, any more than Sclater's lemurs, have swum across the vast, salty oceans that now separated their graves. He also looked to the rocks themselves. He traced the lines of ancient, distinctive rock formations and mountain chains, finding that the geological structures of the Appalachian Mountains in the eastern United States seemed to match, in both age and type, the Caledonian Mountains of Scotland and Scandinavia. It was as if a single, great mountain range had been formed and then literally torn in two, its fragments drifting apart on different continental rafts. All of this evidence, he argued, pointed to one inescapable and world-shattering conclusion. The continents had not always been where they are now. They had, in the deep past, been joined together in a single colossal supercontinent, which he would later name Pangaea, and had, over hundreds of millions of years, slowly, inexorably, drifted apart to their present locations. This new theory offered a solution to Sclater's original lemur puzzle that was far more elegant and far more comprehensive than a hypothetical sunken bridge. In Wegener's model, there was no need to sink a continent to explain the lemurs. Instead, Madagascar, the Indian subcontinent, and the African continent had simply, in a much earlier age, been connected. They had all been part of the great southern supercontinent, Gondwanaland, a component of Pangaea, and had later fractured and drifted away from each other. The lemurs and their ancestors had simply walked across a land that was at the time contiguous. The Indian Ocean was not a graveyard. It was a new ocean, an expanse of water that had formed in the gap left behind as India and Madagascar tore away from Africa and began their long, slow geological journey to the north and east. Wegener's continental drift hypothesis was a direct scientific challenge to the very necessity of Lemuria. It explained all the same biological data, but it did so without requiring an entire continent to violate the laws of physics and vanish into the Earth's mantle. It was a theory that in time would completely rewrite the story of our planet. However, in the early 20th century, Wegener's idea was met with profound, entrenched, and often vicious resistance from the scientific establishment. The geologists and geophysicists of the day ridiculed his theory, dismissing him as a mere meteorologist who had wandered out of his field. Their primary and perfectly valid objection was one of mechanism. Wegener could see that the continents had drifted, but he could not explain how. What force, they demanded, was powerful enough to plow these colossal slabs of granite through the denser, solid rock of the ocean floor? Wegener had no good answer. He proposed the pull of the moon or the spin of the earth, forces that were quickly and correctly calculated to be laughably insufficient. Because he lacked a mechanism, his revolutionary idea was relegated to the fringes of science, considered a crackpot theory for decades. And in this long intellectual twilight, the period from the 1920s to the 1950s, when continental drift was a joke in polite geological society, the sunken land bridge hypothesis, while mortally wounded, was not yet definitively dead. This scientific uncertainty, this lack of a final accepted answer, created the perfect gray zone, a space of possibility where the mystical Lemuria, the city of Telos, and the empire of Mu could continue to thrive, unbothered by a scientific consensus that was itself in a state of profound, if unacknowledged, confusion. The ground, quite literally, was shifting under everyone's feet. That long intellectual twilight, that comfortable gray zone, where both continental drift and sunken land bridges seemed to be equally flawed and unproven theories, was destined to be shattered. The decisive blow came not from a single, brilliant mind like Wegener's, but from a new, unprecedented, and globally funded age of technological exploration. The Second World War and the subsequent Cold War had, for reasons of military and submarine strategy, driven a sudden and intense interest in understanding the one great remaining blank spot on the map of the Earth, the deep ocean floor. For the first time, humanity was not just a surface dweller scraping at the coastlines. We were developing the tools to truly see the abyss. In the 1950s and 1960s, a fleet of research vessels, equipped with new technologies like sonar, sound navigation and ranging, and magnetometers, began to meticulously crisscross the oceans, pinging sound waves into the depths and listening for their echoes. They were, piece by piece, creating the first true maps of the other two-thirds of the world, a world that was supposed to be a flat, cold, silent, and featureless plain of mud, the ancient, unchanging bed of the sea. What these maps revealed, however, was not a flat, dead world. It was a world that was, in fact, more geologically violent, more dynamic, and more bizarrely structured than anyone had ever dreamed. The sonar readings revealed that the oceans were hiding the largest and longest mountain range on the entire planet. This was not a chain of sunken peaks, but a continuous 40,000-mile-long global seam, a mid-ocean ridge that snaked its way through the center of every major ocean, like the raised stitching on a baseball. As they mapped this ridge, particularly the mid-Atlantic ridge that so perfectly bisected the ocean between Africa and South America, they discovered it was not cold and dead, but volcanically active, a place where new, molten rock was actively, constantly welling up from the Earth's interior. The ocean floor, it seemed, was being born in these places. Then, the magnetometers, tools designed to measure magnetic fields, revealed an even stranger puzzle. They found that the rocks of the ocean floor were arranged in a series of perfectly symmetrical, parallel stripes of alternating magnetic polarity, fanning out from either side of the mid-ocean ridges. Scientists realized they were looking at a tape recording of the Earth's history. The planet's magnetic field is known to flip its polarity every few 100,000 years. As new, molten rock emerged at the ridge, its iron minerals would cool and lock in the direction of the magnetic field at that moment in time. The map of magnetic stripes was therefore an irrefutable visual record of the seabed spreading apart, pushing outward from the central ridge like a pair of immense, slow-moving conveyor belts. This discovery, known as seafloor spreading, was the missing mechanism, the engine that Wegener had been so cruelly mocked for not finding. The continents were not, as he had crudely imagined, plowing through the ocean floor. The ocean floor was carrying them. The entire crust of the planet, both continental and oceanic, was not a single solid shell. It was a mosaic, a jigsaw puzzle of giant, rigid plates, all floating, all moving on the hot, pliable, molten rock of the mantle beneath. This was the birth of the unified, revolutionary, and now universally accepted theory of plate tectonics. In this new, elegant, and proven model, the mid-ocean ridges were the constructive zones, the seams where new plate material was constantly being created, pushing the plates apart. To balance this creation, there had to be destructive zones, and the sonar maps had found those too. These were the deep sea trenches, like the Mariana Trench in the Pacific, unfathomably deep gashes in the seabed where one plate was being forced to dive under another, melting back into the mantle in a process called subduction. This was the engine of all geology, the creation, the lateral, sideways movement, and the destruction of the Earth's crust. This new, definitive understanding of how our planet works was the final, scientific, and unanswerable death knell for Sclater's Lemuria. Plate tectonics did not just make the land bridge unnecessary, it made it, in its proposed form, impossible. The new geophysical data confirmed a crucial difference between the two types of crust on Earth. Continental crust, the rock that makes up the land we live on, is thick but relatively light and buoyant, like a block of ancient light wood. Oceanic crust, the rock that forms the seabed, is thin but much denser, like a waterlogged plank. The central, fatal flaw in the sunken continent hypothesis was this simple fact of buoyancy. A continent cannot sink. You cannot, by the laws of physics, make a block of light, granitic crust simply sink down into the denser basaltic mantle and disappear. It is physically impossible, like trying to sink a cork in a bucket of water. The continents could be torn apart, as Gondwanaland was. They could be crumpled up, forming mountains like the Himalayas, where India, having drifted all the way across the Indian Ocean, collided with Asia. They could be flooded by shallow seas, but they could not, and did not, founder and vanish into the deep abyss. The mystery that Philip Sclater had so ingeniously tried to solve was now definitively answered. The lemurs and the ferns were separated by an ocean because that ocean was new, a void created by the slow, inexorable, and lateral drift of continents. The original scientific need for Lemuria was gone, and the geological mechanism for its sinking was proven to be a fantasy. The scientists, the geologists, and the zoologists all packed up their maps of Lemuria and filed them away, a relic of a brilliant but profoundly wrong 19th century idea. The great sunken landmass had been, in the world of science, finally and irrevocably sunk by the very ocean floor it was supposed to be made of. The theory of plate tectonics was, for the world of science, a complete and total intellectual victory. It was a unifying theory that explained everything from earthquakes and volcanoes to the distribution of fossils, and it did so with a beautiful, predictive elegance. In the clear light of this new paradigm, the very concept of a sunken continent in a deep ocean basin was rendered a physical impossibility, a charming but obsolete relic of 19th century thought, like the luminiferous ether or the theory of phlogiston. The scientific case was, for all intents and purposes, closed, but a myth, particularly one as powerful and deeply felt as Lemuria, is not so easily undone by a new geological model. A story that has taken root in the human heart, that speaks to a profound longing for a lost golden age, is rarely, if ever, dislodged by an argument about the comparative buoyancy of granitic and basaltic crust. For those who still believed, the maps of William Scott Elliot and the grand psychic histories of Blavatsky were a truth that superseded the dry formulas of geophysics. The scientific theory, they could argue, was just that, a theory, a new dogma from the same establishment that had, for decades, mocked Wegener's drift. Perhaps the laws of physics were incomplete. Perhaps the sinking of Lemuria had been a cataclysm so profound, a cosmic event, that it operated outside the slow, grinding rules of plate tectonics. The only way to truly know, to satisfy both the skeptic and the believer, was not just to map the seabed, but to go down there, to look for the ruins, to brush the silt from the cyclopean walls of its fabled cities. The new age of deep-sea exploration, which had birthed plate tectonics, now offered a second, even more direct, way to test the legend. And so, the search began, though it was not a search for Lemuria, but a systematic, scientific exploration of the deep ocean floor. In the decades following the 1960s, our technology for plumbing the abyss grew at an astonishing pace. We built bathyscaphs like the Trieste that could dive to the deepest point on Earth, the Challenger Deep, surviving pressures that could crush a battleship. We developed nimble, robotic, remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, and human-occupied submersibles like the famous Alvin, which could descend for hours, their powerful lights cutting, for the first time, small cones of clarity into an eternal, crushing blackness. We perfected sonar mapping, moving from vague, fuzzy profiles to high-resolution, three-dimensional charts of the seabed, revealing its every canyon, plain, and peak with stunning clarity. These new eyes and hands descended again and again into the very heart of Philip Sclater's and James Churchward's proposed kingdoms. They explored the vast, submarine plateaus of the Indian Ocean, such as the Kerguelen Plateau and the Mascarene Plateau, places that, on a simple map, looked tantalizingly like the flooded foundations of a lost land. They drifted over the immense, flat abyssal plains of the Central Pacific, the very empire of the sun that Churchward had described. They surveyed the jagged volcanic chains of the mid-ocean ridges, the supposed epicenters of the great cataclysms. And what they found in all of these places was a world of profound, primal, and magnificent geology, but not a single, solitary trace of archaeology. There were no monolithic blocks, no fallen statues, no hint of a right angle or a road-like structure. There were no submerged pyramids, no crystal temples, no cyclopean walls. The lights of the submersibles illuminated a world of pillow lavas, black basalt rock frozen in the act of bubbling up from the Earth's mantle. They found strange, shimmering hydrothermal vents, the black smokers that we mentioned, building great chimney-like castles of pure mineral deposits. But these were the natural sculptures of chemistry and heat, not the work of sentient hands. They found a world draped in a fine, delicate, and unimaginably deep blanket of marine snow, the slow, ceaseless rain of microscopic shells, dust, and organic detritus that has been accumulating, undisturbed, for millions upon millions of years. This, in the end, was the most definitive evidence of all, even more powerful than the sonar maps. Scientists began to drill into this deep-sea floor, extracting long, cylindrical cores of the sediment, tubes of mud that provided a perfect, layered book of the ocean's past. They were reading the autobiography of the seabed, and this autobiography, which stretched back not just thousands, but tens of millions of years, told one unambiguous story. Its pages were filled, layer after layer, with the microscopic calcium carbonate shells of foraminifera, the glassy silica skeletons of radiolaria, tiny oceanic creatures that live and die in the water column. Its pages contained thin dustings of volcanic ash from distant eruptions and fine, wind-blown silt carried from continents thousands of miles away. What these cores never contained, at any point in the last 65 million years, was a single, definitive layer of terrestrial soil. There was no pollen from flowers or pine trees. There were no freshwater diatoms, no fossils of land-based insects, no fragments of wood, no grains of river sand. There was not one particle of evidence to suggest that the deep floor of the Indian or Pacific Ocean had ever been dry land, a world of air and sunlight, a place where a jungle could grow or a city could be built. The seabed, in its profound, unbroken silence, spoke its truth. It had always been an ocean. The cities of Lemuria were not there. The silence from the deep was not a mystery. It was an answer. The definitive, silent, and undisturbed mud of the deep ocean floor should have been the final, quiet end of this story. The laws of physics, written in the buoyant, granitic nature of continental crust, had rendered the very concept of a sunken continent an impossibility. The sonar maps, the core samples, and the submersible photographs had all returned from the abyss with the same unambiguous report. There was nothing there. The case for Lemuria, the scientific hypothesis born of a lemur's strange geography, was now thoroughly, completely, and permanently closed. The cities were not hidden by the waves. They were absent, and yet the story did not die. It did not fade into the obscurity of a charming 19th century scientific error. Instead, liberated from the burdensome need to be real, the myth of Lemuria simply migrated, shedding its last ties to Sclater's zoology and Haeckel's fossils, and moved permanently into a realm where core samples and magnetic stripes are utterly irrelevant. The vast, uncharted territory of the human imagination. The true, enduring mystery of Lemuria is not that it sank, but why we, as a species, so desperately need it to have existed. Its survival, in the face of all physical evidence, reveals a profound psychological truth. The lost continent is an archetype, one of the great recurring narratives of the human soul, a story that we have told ourselves in countless forms since we first began to tell stories at all. It is the myth of the Golden Age, the memory of a paradise lost, a state of grace from which we have, by some tragedy, fallen. This narrative is woven into the very fabric of our oldest cultures. It is the Garden of Eden, a place of innocent, naked communion with the divine, lost to the burden of knowledge. It is the Satya Yuga, or Age of Truth in Hindu cosmology, a long, distant epoch of pure-hearted, long-lived, and gigantic beings who lived in perfect harmony, an age that has since degenerated into our own chaotic Kali Yuga. It is the Age of Gold described by the Greek poet Hesiod, when mortals lived like gods without sorrow of heart, remote and free from toil and grief. Theosophy, in its 19th century brilliance, did not invent this story. It simply and brilliantly rebranded it for a modern, scientific-minded age. It took this ancient, spiritual longing and draped it in the borrowed authority of zoology and geology. Lemuria, in Blavatsky's hands, became the new, improved Eden for the evolutionary age. Its inhabitants, the third root race, were the perfect embodiment of this golden age dream. They were the pre-intellectual, pre-egoic, telepathic giants, living in a unified, dreamlike state of consciousness, their third eye still open to the soul of the world. Their story is a tragedy of the descent into matter, a fall from this state of psychic unity into the cold, sharp, isolating world of the two-eyed intellect. The story of Lemuria is, at its heart, a profound, romantic, and deeply felt lament for our own lost, intuitive selves, a nostalgic dream of a time before the thinking mind built a wall between us and the world. This dream of a lost past is also, inevitably, a powerful critique of the present. We conjure these perfect utopian worlds, these Lemurias, these Atlantises, these crystal cities of Talos, to serve as a mirror, a yardstick against which we measure our own troubled and imperfect society. The late 19th century, when this myth was truly born, was a time of profound dislocation. The air was choked with the coal smoke of the Industrial Revolution. Ancient traditions were being shattered by a new, cold materialism, and the dogmas of established religion were proving for many to be hollow. The myth of Lemuria offered a better story, a cleaner, more spiritual origin. It suggested that our true ancestors were not just missing links in a brutal, materialist struggle for survival, but were wise, gentle, psychic sages. This story continues to resonate today, perhaps more powerfully than ever, for the very same reasons. In a world that feels increasingly fragmented, ecologically fragile, and spiritually hungry, the tale of a lost, harmonious, and enlightened civilization is a potent, comforting, and deeply seductive idea. It whispers that this, our current world, is not the real one. It is the fallen one. It suggests that our wars, our pollution, and our anxieties are not the inevitable end of the human story, but a temporary, terrible diversion from our true Lemurian destiny. Furthermore, the lost nature of this knowledge is its most alluring feature. It transforms history from a set of facts to be learned into a mystery to be solved, a secret to be initiated into. It is a profoundly Gnostic impulse. It tells the seeker that the real truth, the secret doctrine, was not lost, but hidden by a conspiracy of mundane forces, and that it is only available to those few, the clairvoyant, the channeler, the true believer who have the key. It creates a special, elite lineage, a thread of secret knowledge passed down from the sages of Mu to the priests of Atlantis, to the masters in Telos, and finally to you, the modern adept. It offers a story that is grander, more magical, and far more personally empowering than the mundane academic official story of history. This is why the silence of the seabed in the end does not matter. The story of Lemuria is no longer written on clay tablets or maps of the ocean floor. It is written on the human heart, and it is a story about our own unquenchable and perhaps defining hope for a lost and future perfection. The story of Lemuria, as we have seen it unfold, was a modern Western invention, a myth born of science, adopted by occultism, and perfected by the New Age. It was a narrative projected onto the blank spaces of the 19th century map, a solution to a European intellectual puzzle. And yet, as we concluded, the psychological need for such a story, the archetype of a lost, golden, and flooded paradise, is one of the most ancient and universal instincts of the human heart. This powerful archetype did not wait for 19th century zoologists to give it a name. In other parts of the world, on the shores of the very ocean that was supposed to hide this lost land, a similar, older, and deeply independent story was already being told, a story born not of scientific speculation, but of cultural memory. To find this story, we must travel to the sun-drenched southern tip of the Indian subcontinent, to the home of the Tamil people. The Tamils are the inheritors of one of the world's great classical civilizations, a culture with a continuous, unbroken literary tradition that stretches back for more than 2 millennia. Their language, Tamil, is a living, breathing vessel of antiquity, its most ancient poetry still read and revered. And within this vast, rich, and profoundly proud literary tradition lies a foundational legend, a narrative of such epic scope that it makes all of modern history feel like a mere postscript. This is the legend of the Sangams, the great ancient academies of poets and scholars. This tradition, recorded in medieval commentaries on the surviving ancient texts, tells not of one, but of 3 great Sangams. The third of these, the Kadai Sankam, the last academy, was said to have been held in the modern city of Madurai, and it is from this era that the surviving masterpieces of classical Tamil poetry, the Sangam literature that we can read today, are said to have come. But the legend insists that this, our entire surviving inheritance, is but a fragment, the shadow of a far greater past. Before this third Sangam, there was a second Sangam, the Adai Sankam, which was held in a different, now lost capital city named Kapatapuram. This academy, too, flourished for thousands of years, producing immense, lost epics, until it, too, was destroyed. And before that, In the deep primordial mists of the Tamil past, there was the first Sangam, the Tala-Ikankam. This, the legend states, was an assembly of gods, sages, and legendary poets held in a magnificent first capital city known as then Madurai, or South Madurai. It was the golden age of Tamil civilization, a time of perfect poetry and profound wisdom, and it was said to have lasted for 4,240 years. This, the tradition maintains, was the true original home of the Tamil people, a vast and fertile land. But this first and greatest of all worlds, the homeland of the gods and the cradle of their language, was not destined to last. The legend concludes, in a refrain that echoes through the commentaries, that this entire land, with its great capital, its poets, and its libraries, was taken by the sea. It was devoured by a kettle coal, a catastrophic and all-consuming sea seizure, a great deluge. This ancient indigenous narrative, existing long before Philip Sclater ever pondered a lemur, tells of a vast, civilized land, the original motherland of the Tamil people, that now lies submerged beneath the waves of the Indian Ocean, south of the modern-day Cape of Kanyakumari. The survivors, the legend implies, are the Tamil people themselves, a civilization living in the shadow of a profound, prehistoric loss, their surviving literature a mere echo of the true, lost classics of their first, sunken world. This lost territory, in later post-15th century texts, was given a specific name, Kumari Kandam. The name, which translates to the Virgin Land, or the Land of the Virgin Princess, an epithet of the goddess Kanyakumari, whose temple sits at the very tip of India, staring out at the ocean that is her domain, became the definitive label for this lost, antediluvian paradise. Here we must be very clear. The legend of Kumari Kandam and the 19th century myth of Lemuria are two entirely separate streams of thought, their origins thousands of years and thousands of miles apart. Lemuria was a scientific hypothesis built to explain the migration of primates. Kumari Kandam was a cultural narrative, a folk memory, an origin story built to explain the fragments of a glorious literary past and the perceived loss of a greater one. The Kumari Kandam legend speaks of a human civilization, of poets, kings, and cities, not of 15-foot-tall, third-eyed, egg-laying giants. It is a story of cultural memory, not of cosmic evolution. And yet, the parallels are impossible to ignore. Both speak of a vast, civilized land. Both place this land in the Indian Ocean, and both describe its end as a catastrophic sinking beneath the waves. While geology, as we have seen, refutes the possibility of an entire continent sinking, it actively supports the core, historical trauma that may be at the heart of the Kumari Kandam legend. Since the end of the last ice age, some 12,000 years ago, the sea levels around India have risen by as much as 100 meters. This was not a slow, gentle rise, but a series of dramatic, rapid inundations as the great ice sheets melted. It is a geological certainty that vast, fertile, and populated coastal plains, ancient homes, hunting grounds, and perhaps even large settlements were, in the deep, oral past of the Tamil people, swallowed by the sea. The Kadalkol was not a single mythical event, but a very real, recurring, and terrifying geological process, a memory of coastal subsidence and rising waters that was passed down through generations, eventually becoming codified into the epic, foundational legend of a great, lost, and perfect land. Kumari Kandam, then, may not be a fantasy, but a profound mythologized memory of a real physical homeland, its shores now lost to the patient, rising tides of history. We are now faced with two distinct and parallel streams of thought, both flowing toward the same sunken conclusion, yet originating in worlds that could not be more different. On one side, we have the Western, 19th century invention of Lemuria, a myth that began in a zoologist's notebook, was adopted by a German biologist, and was finally canonized into a grand spiritual epic by a Russian occultist in New York. On the other side, we have the ancient indigenous and literary tradition of Kumari Kandam, a narrative born from the classical poetry and cultural memory of the Tamil people, a story of a lost poetic golden age, a homeland of kings and sages swallowed by the sea. For millennia, these two stories ran their separate courses, one a modern speculation, the other an ancient memory. But in the turbulent, intellectually fertile world of the late 19th and early 20th century, these two great rivers of thought were inevitably destined to meet, to flow into one another, and to create a new, powerful, and syncretic myth. This confluence occurred in the context of a changing India. The British Raj was at its zenith, but so too was a rising tide of Indian nationalism, a profound cultural and political reawakening. In the South, this took the form of the Tamil Renaissance, a movement in which Tamil scholars, writers, and political thinkers sought to reclaim, celebrate, and elevate the profound antiquity of their own non-Sanskritic Dravidian civilization. They were engaged in a deep cultural project to assert the uniqueness, originality, and immense age of the Tamil language and its literature, often in direct opposition to the colonial and North Indian, Aryan narratives that tended to marginalize their history. It was an act of profound intellectual and cultural self-defense, a search for the deepest possible roots of their identity. Into this fervent atmosphere of cultural revival, the Western-born ideas of Theosophy arrived with a powerful and perhaps unexpected resonance. The Theosophical Society, founded in part by Blavatsky, had established its new international headquarters in 1882, not in London or New York, but in Adyar, a suburb of Madras, now Chennai, in the very heart of the Tamil-speaking world. Theosophy, with its deep reverence for Hindu and Buddhist thought, its talk of karma and reincarnation, and its championing of ancient wisdom, was seen by many Indian intellectuals not as a foreign colonial import, but as a Western validation of their own indigenous spiritual heritage. Theosophists like Annie Besant became, ironically, prominent figures in the Indian Home Rule movement, their occult philosophy providing a strange, spiritual underpinning for a new national consciousness. It was in this environment that Tamil scholars, nationalists, and writers began to read the popular, esoteric, and scientific literature of the West. And when they encountered Sclater's, Haeckel's, and most importantly Blavatsky's and Scott Eliot's Lemuria, they must have been struck with a profound, earth-shattering sense of recognition. Here were the great minds of the West, using their own tools of science and clairvoyance, describing a massive lost continent, a cradle of civilization located in the exact same place, the Indian Ocean, just south of the peninsula, where their own ancient poetic legends had placed the sunken land of Kumari Kandam. It was a perfect, irresistible, and seemingly miraculous corroboration. The Western myth, which had been built to explain lemurs and root races, was seen as definitive scientific proof of the literal historical truth of the Tamil first Sangam. The Kadalkol, the seizure by the sea, was no longer a poetic folk memory. It was a geologically verified event, the same event that had sunk Blavatsky's Lemuria. A conscious and intellectual and political conflation began to occur. Tamil writers, in their journals, books, and speeches, began to adopt the Western name, using Lemuria and Kumari Kandam as direct synonyms. They pointed to the maps of Scott Elliot as proof, as an independent Western admission that the true original cradle of all humanity was not in Sumer or Egypt or in the Aryan North, but in their own lost Dravidian motherland. This syncretism transformed both myths. For the Tamils, it took their ancient poetic legend and fortified it, turning it into a hard geopolitical and historical fact, a weapon in their cultural and political struggle. They could now argue, the direct lineal descendants of Blavatsky's third root race, the Lemurians, the oldest and most spiritual civilized people on Earth. The myth of Kumari Kandam, now fused with the scientific and mystical authority of Lemuria, became a central, foundational pillar of modern Tamil nationalism and the Dravidian identity movement. It was a grand counter-narrative, a story of ultimate antiquity that established their culture as the source from which all others, including their Aryan rivals, were merely degenerate, later offshoots. The Western myth, born of a colonial-era scientific puzzle, had been reappropriated, reinterpreted, and sent back to the West, not as a mystical fantasy, but as the charged political and historical truth of a living people. While the ancient Tamil legend of Kumari Kandam was breathing a new political and historical fire into the myth, back in the Western world, Lemuria was preparing for a second and perhaps even more influential resurrection. The world had changed profoundly since Blavatsky's time. The late 1960s and 1970s had ushered in a great cultural countercurrent, a widespread disillusionment with mainstream institutions, a deep yearning for ecological harmony, and a passionate individualistic search for spiritual meaning outside the confines of traditional religion. This was the birth of what would come to be called the New Age movement, a vast, eclectic, and decentralized tapestry of belief, blending Eastern mysticism, Western esotericism, pop psychology, and a profound utopian hope for a coming age of Aquarius. This new spiritual marketplace was not one of dense, 1,400-page secret doctrines or rigid hierarchical societies like Theosophy. It was a world of weekend workshops, of holistic healing, of meditation, and most crucially, of a new democratized form of revelation, channeling. This phenomenon was, in essence, a modern, more personal evolution of Blavatsky's claimed contact with Mahatmas or Frederick Spencer Oliver's amanuensis. A channel, or channeler, was a person who claimed to be able to enter a trance state and allow a non-physical, higher consciousness being to speak directly through them, their voice and mannerisms often changing completely as the entity took possession. This movement exploded in the 1980s. Suddenly, it seemed, a whole host of ancient, wise, and profoundly compassionate beings were lining up, eager to share their wisdom with a troubled humanity. There were entities claiming to be ascended masters, like Saint-Germain, extraterrestrial collectives from star systems like the Pleiades, and even disembodied wisecracking personalities like Seth or Ramtha. And among this chorus of celestial and historical voices, a new, gentle, and profoundly ancient group began to make itself known, the Lemurian Elders. Through these new, self-published books, audio tapes, and live channeling sessions, the story of Lemuria was retold, but it was a story that had been profoundly and beautifully retuned for a new generation. The complex, dark, and often judgmental cosmology of Blavatsky, the sin of the Lemurians, their miscegenation with animal-like creatures, their karmic doom, was almost entirely scrubbed from the narrative. The new channeled Lemuria was a story of almost unimaginable peace, beauty, and spiritual light. It was, in this telling, the first great experiment in unconditional love on planet Earth. The Lemurians were no longer the lumbering, third-eyed, egg-laying giants of a primitive past. They were a highly advanced, peaceful, and fully conscious civilization of light workers and star seeds, beings who lived in a state of perfect, fifth-dimensional consciousness, their world a true, physical plane paradise of harmony with nature. In this New Age revival, the cataclysm was also reframed. The sinking of the continent was not a punishment for sin, a karmic cleansing of a fallen race. It was instead a tragic but known event, a natural geological cycle that the wise clairvoyant Lemurians had foreseen for millennia. They did not fall, they simply and lovingly withdrew. Theirs was a graceful, conscious ascension, a deliberate transition from the physical plane. As the great continent of Mu, the name Mu was now almost universally preferred, as it sounded softer and more mystical than the scientific Lemuria, slowly and gently sank beneath the waves, the majority of its inhabitants. This narrative explained simply ascended, their bodies dissolving into light, their consciousness returning to the higher, non-physical dimensions from which they had come. But the story did not end there. A select few, the story went, were given a sacred task to preserve the Lemurian vibration within the physical earth, to tend to the planet's crystalline grid, and to act as a beacon of light, holding the memory of this perfect love, waiting for the day when surface humanity would be vibrationally ready to receive it again. And where did these guardians go? The answer now was obvious. The myth streams flowing together into a single, perfect channel. They went to the great, hollowed-out crystal city of Telos, deep within the heart of Mount Shasta, the Californian volcano which had already been primed by Oliver and the I Am movement, now became the undisputed global epicenter of this revived Lemurian myth. Telos was no longer just a rumor or a hidden refuge. It was an active capital. Books, channeled directly from Adama, high priest of Telos, began to appear, offering intimate, detailed, and loving descriptions of life in the subterranean city. These texts were not dry, like Scott Eliot's. They were spiritual self-help manuals, filled with guided meditations, loving affirmations, and instructions on how to connect with the Lemurian heart inside oneself. The Telosians were our elder brothers and sisters, our family of light, who were at this very moment broadcasting waves of pure, unconditional love from their crystal temples, helping to heal the planet and awaken humanity from its long spiritual slumber. The myth had become a therapeutic, interactive promise of a great reunion, a coming day when the Telosians would finally reveal themselves. Their silver ships would fill the sky, and the new, fifth-dimensional golden age of Lemuria would dawn upon the surface of the earth. This profound, therapeutic, and deeply personal new chapter in the Lemurian saga, a story of loving elders waiting patiently for us in a crystal city, created an immense global community of believers. But this community, like all human endeavors, still existed on the physical plane. The channeled messages from Adama of Telos were profoundly comforting, the guided meditations deeply moving, but the human heart, even in its most spiritual state, often craves more than just a disembodied voice or a mental image. It craves connection, it craves ritual, and perhaps most of all, it craves relics. It yearns for a tangible physical object, a true cross from the sunken paradise, something that can be held in the hand, a solid, earthly anchor for an ethereal, celestial belief. The myth of Telos was beautiful, but it was by its own definition inaccessible, hidden beneath a mountain. The New Age movement, in its popular, commercial, and tactile brilliance, would soon provide the perfect solution, a physical piece of Lemuria that you could buy, own, and carry in your pocket. This solution, this new, tangible link to the lost motherland, came in the form of quartz. But this was not just any quartz. It was a very specific and often very beautiful formation of quartz crystal, which began to appear in the international gem and mineral market in the late 1990s and early 2000s, primarily at first from the prolific mines of the Diamantina region in Brazil. These were not the familiar, perfectly clear, six-sided points of classic quartz. These new crystals were often slightly tapered, their faces were not always perfectly symmetrical or polished, and they possessed one strange and absolutely definitive characteristic. Their sides, rather than being smooth, were etched with a pattern of fine, horizontal, parallel lines, or striations. These lines ran up the shaft of the crystal, creating a grooved, textured surface, almost like a barcode etched into the stone. In the world of mineralogy, these striations are a well-understood and common phenomenon, a result of the crystal's specific growth patterns and interference from other minerals in the deep hydrothermal fissures where they form. But in the fertile, symbolic world of the New Age, this barcode was not a geological artifact. It was an inscription. It was a sign, a message. And the story that emerged around these specific, striated crystals was a perfect, brilliant, and seamless extension of the entire, evolving Lemurian myth. These, the new lore declared, were not just crystals, they were Lemurian seed crystals. The narrative that was channeled and shared in workshops, online forums, and at gem shows was this. In the final, twilight days of the great Lemurian civilization, as the wise, spiritually advanced masters foresaw the coming cataclysm, they knew their sacred knowledge, their profound understanding of love, vibration, and the cosmos was too precious to be lost. The seed of the race was being saved in Telos, but the seed of their consciousness needed to be preserved for the entire planet, for all their lost children who would one day be ready to awaken. And so, these great masters, these spiritual scientists, gathered in their high temples, using their advanced crystal-based technology, a technology of focused sound, light, and pure intention. They programmed or encoded their entire library of wisdom, their complete Akashic history, their healing frequencies, and their message of unconditional love into these special, waiting quartz crystals. These were not just programmed crystals, they were time capsules. Once encoded, these seed crystals were said to have been taken by the Lemurians themselves and planted in the earth, like a cosmic farmer sowing a field. They were deliberately and lovingly buried in specific grid-like patterns in sacred, geologically stable locations around the globe, like the rich, quartz-bearing fields of Brazil, where they would lie dormant, sleeping in the dark womb of the earth for thousands, even millions of years. Their mission was to wait. They were to wait for the great vibrational shift of the planet, the great awakening of the New Age, a time when humanity's consciousness would finally evolve to a frequency high enough to find them, and more importantly, to read them. The late 20th century, this story concluded, was that time. The crystals, their long slumber over, were now allowing themselves to be found. They were, in this narrative, surfacing in the mines of Brazil, not by geological chance, but by spiritual appointment. Each Lemurian seed crystal was therefore not just a pretty rock, it was a living, conscious entity, an ancient library, a key to a forgotten door. Its purpose was to be found by a specific person, a light worker, or a reincarnated Lemurian soul who was vibrationally attuned to its specific frequency. The barcodes, the story explained, were the mechanism of use. In meditation, the seeker was instructed to hold the crystal and gently, slowly, rub a finger or a fingernail up and down these horizontal striations. This physical, tactile act was said to activate the crystal to unlock the data, allowing the stored ancient information to download directly into the user's subconscious, pineal gland, or heart mind. This was not an intellectual reading of data, but a direct energetic transfusion of wisdom, feeling, and memory. By meditating with these crystals, one could, it was claimed, reactivate their own Lemurian DNA, heal deep past life traumas, and connect directly to the loving crystalline energy grid of Telos and the elders within Mount Shasta. This new belief was a masterstroke of mythological evolution. It took the vast, abstract, and inaccessible story of a sunken continent and a hidden city, and it placed a piece of that story, a physical, purchasable, and deeply personal relic, into the palm of the seeker's hand. The lost continent of Lemuria was no longer just a place you could read about or dream about. It was a connection you could hold, a sacred tool you could use, a barcode you could scan to download the lost, sacred, and healing data of paradise. The myth, now anchored in the physical world by these tangible striated seed crystals, had achieved a new kind of permanence, a personal and tactile connection that resonated with the individual seeker. But in the final decades of the 20th century and the dawn of the 21st, a new, global, and ethereal medium was emerging, a place that was, in its own way, as vast, as unexplored, and as full of strange, self-generating architectures as any lost continent of the imagination. This was the digital world, the interconnected, luminous web of the internet, a realm of pure information that would become the myth's final and most powerful amplifier. Lemuria, which had once been a story told in dusty journals, dense books, and whispered enchantings, was now to be reborn as a digital ghost, a modern media myth, its fragments scattered and replicated 1,000,000 times over in the bright, flowing streams of code. This new digital life allowed the story to bifurcate, to flow simultaneously down two parallel but deeply interconnected rivers, the river of entertainment and the river of belief. In the realm of entertainment, the core components of the Lemurian Atlantean Mu saga, the high-tech, enlightened ancient civilization, the fall from grace, the cataclysmic sinking, and the preservation of secret knowledge or powerful artifacts, were so perfectly formed, so archetypally resonant, that they were absorbed wholesale into the very DNA of modern science fiction and fantasy. They became a trope, a foundational world-building toolkit for storytellers, a perfect, ready-made explanation for any ancient mystery a plot required. In the world of fantasy novels, the lineage of Robert E. Howard's Kull of Atlantis and Conan stories, which were themselves deeply influenced by Theosophy and Churchward, gave way to countless new epics. Authors, free from the constraints of history, could now play with these sunken kingdoms as they wished. Lemuria became a setting, a land of dark, reptilian sorcerers, as it did in the Marvel comic universe, home to the deviants, the genetic rivals of the Eternals. Or it was a land of high ethereal magic, its seed crystals becoming the power source for a grand magical war. It was the perfect, ultimate ancient past, a time so remote that any power, any technology, any strange, non-human race could be believably posited there, their ruins and relics waiting to be discovered by the novel's heroes. This gamification of the myth found its most potent expression in the new immersive worlds of video games, particularly the sprawling narratives of Japanese role-playing games, or JRPGs. In these digital realms, the lost floating continent, or the sunken high-tech city, became a recurring and beloved level. A game like Chrono Trigger, for example, would tell the story of the Kingdom of Zeal, a magical floating paradise that through its hubristic abuse of a powerful entity is cast down from the heavens, its story a perfect echo of the Atlantean fall. In other games, Mu or Lemuria would be a literal, optional, endgame dungeon, a sunken crystalline ruin at the bottom of the sea where players could sail their airships to find the ultimate weapon or the lost magic, the digital equivalent of a Lemurian seed crystal. These games, played by millions, were, for an entire generation, the first and only place they would ever encounter the name Lemuria, forever cementing it in their minds as a real, if fictional, place of mystery, magic, and immense lost power. But alongside this river of fiction, the river of belief was also using this new digital technology to carve a deeper and wider channel. The esoteric online communities of the 1990s and 2000s, the Usenet groups, the email lists, the cluttered rainbow-hued GeoCities websites, became the new, decentralized Theosophical lodges. Here, the truth of Lemuria was not a game. It was a living, breathing, and urgent spiritual reality. The channelers no longer needed to sell audio tapes. They could simply post their transmissions from Adama of Telos onto a forum where they could be read, discussed, and shared globally, translated into a dozen languages in a matter of hours. As this technology evolved into the social media and video sharing platforms of today, the myth found its perfect viral medium. YouTube, in particular, became a vast digital library of Lemurian truth. Here one could find thousands of videos offering guided meditations to connect with Telos. You could watch healers demonstrate in soft, whispering ASMR-like tones, the correct way to hold and activate your Lemurian seed crystal. You could listen to hours-long, channeled lectures from the Lemurian High Council, discussing the current planetary vibration and offering gentle, loving advice on how to navigate the ascension process. These platforms allowed the myth to be seen and heard, blending the personal, charismatic appeal of the channeler with the instant, global reach of the internet. These two streams, the fictional and the spiritual, now flow side by side, and they constantly bleed into one another. A young person, their imagination first sparked by the sunken shrine of Mu in a video game, might, with a simple, curious, late-night search, find themselves on one of these spiritual YouTube channels. The aesthetic, the language, the very feel of the fictional Crystal City in the game might be so uncannily similar to the channeled descriptions of the real Telos that the boundary between them begins to blur. The fantasy feels like a confirmation of the belief, and the belief feels like the true backstory to the fantasy. The myth has become a self-perpetuating, cross-media ecosystem, a story that is simultaneously a game, a novel, a meditation, a political identity, and for a core of true believers, the most important and secret history of the world. And so, this story, which is now a digital echo in a global machine, a fantasy in a game, and a living channeled truth in a quiet, candlelit room, has completed its long and wondrous journey. We have followed its strange branching river from its very source, a single, logical, but incorrect deduction in a 19th century scientific journal. We watched as Philip Sclater, puzzling over a small, wide-eyed primate, built an imaginary bridge of land across a real ocean, a bridge he dutifully named Lemuria. We saw that name, that empty scientific vessel, plucked from the dry pages of zoology by the grand, sweeping vision of Helena Blavatsky, who filled it with a new, profound, and mystical wine. She transformed a biological pathway into the cradle of our very consciousness, the million-year-old homeland of a giant psychic race, a paradise lost not to sin, but to the slow, necessary, and tragic descent into matter. We have traced its migrations as this new, powerful myth was mapped by the clairvoyant eyes of William Scott Elliott, its shores stretching from Africa to the heart of the Pacific. We saw it become entangled with its great rivals, the older, more famous, and more hubristic story of Atlantis, the kingdom of the intellect, and the newer rival paradise of Mu, Churchward's own utopian motherland. We watched as the story, in an act of profound, imaginative magic, leapt from the deep, inaccessible ocean floor and took root in the solid, sacred ground of a single American mountain, hiding its survivors in the crystal-pure, utopian city of Telos, deep within the heart of Mount Shasta. We felt the ground shift as the earth sciences, the very discipline that had birthed the idea, finally found its own true and definitive answer. The revelation of plate tectonics, the irrefutable scientific truth of seafloor spreading and a buoyant, unsinkable continental crust rendered the need for Lemuria obsolete and its mechanism impossible. The silence of the deep-sea core samples, whispering their long, unbroken history of an ocean that had always been an ocean, was the final, quiet, scientific word. And we have seen how this, in the end, did not matter at all. The myth, liberated from the heavy burden of fact, did not die. It simply and gracefully ascended. It was reborn in the New Age as a story of pure, unconditional love. It became a therapeutic narrative of Lemurian elders, our gentle elder family, broadcasting their healing frequencies from a hidden subterranean home, and it found its perfect modern relics, the Lemurian seed crystals, tangible, purchasable time capsules, their striated barcode-like faces promising a direct, tactile download of ancient, sacred wisdom. The story of Lemuria, in the end, is a perfect modern myth, a testament to the fact that the human imagination, in its profound and unquenchable thirst for meaning, is the most powerful geological force on the planet. It can build a continent where none exists. It can populate it with the ancestors our hearts desire, and it can protect that creation from the erosive, tidal forces of mundane physical proof. Lemuria's enduring power is that it is a story about us. It is the story of our own collective and deeply felt search for our origins. It is a dream of a better beginning. It reflects back to us a profound modern ache, a nostalgia for a time of perceived unity that we have lost, a unity with nature, a unity with the cosmos, and a unity with the intuitive, spiritual parts of ourselves. The third eye that we feel deep in our bones has been closed by the cold, analytical demands of the modern, two-eyed world. The legend of Lemuria is a map, not of the Indian Ocean, but of our own inner longing. It is a story of a lost, gentle paradise, a motherland of the soul. And so, as our long journey into this phantom history comes to its close, the story itself seems to soften, its hard, pseudo-historical edges dissolving like a coastline into the fog. The question of whether the land was real fades into the deep, quiet darkness. The cities, the giants, and the crystals all become part of a new, softer, and more personal landscape. The lights of Talos seem to glow, not from a mountain in California, but from a place deep within your own, resting consciousness. The soft, warm, lapping waves of the lost Lemurian sea are, in the end, a lullaby, a gentle, rhythmic sound whispering that all lost things can be found, that all fractures can be healed, and that the most profound, ancient, and loving home has always been and will always be waiting for you in the deep, peaceful, and restorative kingdom of sleep.